conflicting name tags. No, I don't even know where I put it. I've lost, oh, there it is. I have to brag. What do you think of the improvements? How many have sat in those splinter-ridden seats? And they're continuing to make improvements. You would not see. I'm inviting you all, not at the moment, for a tour backstage. They have done absolute wonders. We are not worthy of what they did. And we had no idea how far they were going to go. But if you want to wander backstage sometime during the week, we are incredibly proud of our new facilities. And now we find out they're going to put more money next year into the front of the house. We also are proud to announce that even though we have tried for the last few years to become fully digital and HD, we are now HD. So we are streaming again. You can be accessed through an EAA site, and they're going to attempt to do the same thing simultaneously and put us on YouTube. So we're a little bit iffy about how well that's going to work. But we are streaming, and we will be every night. Notice it's not me looking better, it's the two beautiful new HD quality projectors. And you'll notice left and right stage, including even more out there. If you can't see where you're sitting, it's your own fault, because we have more monitors than we have ever had before. And here's a warning. We're going to have all the Apollo astronauts. I was here the last time, and they were sitting all the way out to the road. They were sitting as far as the eye could see, left and right, and they were 10 deep around the fence that no one could get beyond. And I think it's going to be bigger this year. We are seating 2019 out here right now in the new chairs. If you come, and you better, because it's probably not going to happen again, bring a chair or come really early. We're going to have a Jumbotron, so there will not be a bad seat in the house. And it's going to be fantastic. It is Friday, okay? Now, I can only carry one day in my head at a time. But it will be, we're going to have announcements and everything else, but it's around 8 o'clock, and it's the final presentation, and David Hartman, again, is repeating as narrator. David is not only a good friend, but is one of the most phenomenal reporters and interviewers that I have ever met. What you don't know about him, and he'll hurt me if he knows I'm saying this, is that as easygoing and as smooth as he is, the hidden part is the weeks and weeks of research. He knows more about the astronauts than they remember themselves. And he is this way for every interview he does. And we owe him, because he gives that kind of dedication to everything he does. And he is not only a good friend of the theater, but a good friend of aviation. So please give him the round of applause when he comes that he deserves. Danny, can you hear me? Yeah. Come on. Since this is kind of the beginning of a new era of nice seats and everything else that's working, I thought we would clear up some of the misinformation that we have had over the years. For years, I've been introducing Danny as going into Ray Schaller, Camp Schaller, his office, and saying, you know what, you've got an empty theater, it's the day before convention, I think there are people who would come. What was the real story?
Okay. I was racing at Reno and had an opportunity to help a number of pilots with presentations, and I used to do forums out there in the old tents years and years ago, and walking by here one Sunday night, This is a much bigger audience. It's better than a tent. I asked the EA if we could do an evening with champions. It was about 30 years ago, and it's really taken off. We've, later in the evening here, I think we'll probably have a full house. So that's how that all got started here.
Okay, second bit of misinformation. He let me announce for a good 10 to 15 years that he had been the pilot of Rare Bear because Ray had told me. Apparently, he just flew paper airplanes. So what is the truth?
Being backstage, I never got a chance to hear all the introductions. I didn't realize he was talking about Rare Bear, and I knew Lyle Shelton, and he offered to check me out in a Warbird if I ever brought one to Reno, but that's as far as I ever got, because the biggest thing I flew at Reno was biplanes.
But he flew them very well, and he told me backstage that the planes he had flown had won far more without him. Yeah. But he had actually been the one that built the planes, right?
Yes, yes. So I won the race in 1990 out of Reno, got the gold, and after 14 years and retired. Thank you. Sold the airplane over the phone to a pilot in Japan who came over the next year, won again in Reno with the airplane, took it home, put it in a museum in Japan. It's in Tokyo. And the other race plane is hanging here in the EA Museum in the Rutan exhibit.
For my books, had he flown Rare Bear, he would have probably won in that too. One of the first things that he told me when I found out that he had been an air racer, because he was always inviting me to come to Reno and see him, so I figured he was a big shot, and apparently he was. He said he wanted to live long enough to see his son grow up, and that really moved me. His son now has somewhat taken over his business, but he's got another gig tonight, so Danny is back at the helm. At any rate, we appreciate the number of years and the effort that it took to convince the hierarchy to let him have the Evening of Champions. And he's the reason you have a place to be tonight. Danny Mortensen.
Thank you, Steve. And a nice round of applause for Steve. He's been here as long as I have, and this thing wouldn't happen without Steve Weaver. So we have a short 3-minute video clip to show you, and then I'll introduce our first speaker. The folks are ready upstairs.
This is the only way to fly. For United Airlines pilot Denny Flanagan, the passenger always comes first. He invites kids into the cockpit, takes pictures of pets, and when his flights are delayed, get this, the snacks are on him. We'll meet this first-class captain in a moment.
Not that much fun to fly right now, and those of us who travel a lot have seen a lot of things go wrong. That includes CBS News transportation correspondent Nancy Cordes, who is live at New York's LaGuardia Airport. Good morning, Nancy.
Good morning, Harry. It has not been a fun summer to fly unless you have had the good fortune to land on this pilot's flight. If you did, you definitely remember it. It was the one that took friendly skies to a whole new altitude.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. For those folks going to LaGuardia Airport today,
it's typically a bad sign when the pilot gets on the PA at the gate. But Denny Flanagan is just out to make a joke.
And this is actually my third flight. Just today.
That's only one hint.
I knew he was kidding.
That this is no ordinary captain.
I've heard stories about you buying 200 hamburgers from McDonald's when your flight is delayed.
Yes.
For the customers.
Yes. And that's just taking care of the customer.
During his pre-flight checks, he's been known to snap photos of the pets in the cargo hold to reassure nervous owners on board. Once everyone is strapped in,
Ladies and gentlemen, it's your captain. We're going to do something a little bit special today. I've got some giveaways.
the real fun begins.
And so we're going to have a little raffle. What I'm going to ask is that you grab a piece of paper or napkin.
This veteran United pilot is on a mission to inject some humanity into an experience that, let's face it, these days can seem pretty dehumanizing.
Hi, thanks for flying with us.
His good deeds have made him a legend on travel chat boards.
I want to read to you some things that people have written about you online.
Okay.
One person wrote, about an hour before landing, he came on the PA and told folks to look at the back of the 757 spec cards he had handed out. If your card had his signature, you won a free bottle of wine.
Yes, I've been doing that for a few years. It's just a little bit to create a little bit of fun atmosphere on the airplane.
And school hasn't started for you either? No. Okay, here's your last reading assignment.
On his flights, unaccompanied minors always get a window seat, and their parents back home always get a phone call from this father of 5.
He said that this is the captain calling. And
Kenneth Klein was shocked to get a call from the runway when his son's flight was held up by bad weather.
It was certainly reassuring that a captain would call me and tell me that everything's all right and everything's going to be taken care of.
And get a load of this. He actually writes personalized thank you notes on the backs of his business card to everyone who's in first class and who's a frequent flyer. This is Miss Corrigan in 6A.
Captains and comments, please.
On our flight from Chicago to LaGuardia, the contest was to write down your most memorable flying experience, good or bad. And look at this. Almost everyone played along.
So our first winner is seat 9A. And the winners of these comments will be receiving a bottle of our fine wine.
You know, you're doing all this stuff. When do you have time to fly the plane?
It takes seconds. You know, walking down the concourse and you see some young kids standing there, stopping to them, talking to them, give them some trading cards. That takes seconds. And it's called working from the heart. You know, that's just working from the heart.
And Captain Flanagan says he takes all these comments and he posts them on bulletin boards around the United system so that the people who work at United can hear about the good and bad experiences that their passengers have been having. Captain Flanagan is 56. He lives with his wife and 5 kids in Cleveland. And Harry, I asked him what he would be doing if he wasn't flying, and you probably won't be surprised to hear he said he'd probably be a full-time dad.
What an impressive guy. But here's the question. Who pays for all those burgers and all those bottles of wine?
Well, he pays for it, but then he gets reimbursed from United, and that could start to be a little bit of a problem because some other pilots are catching on and doing the same thing, and, you know, that could really add up.
It's a small price to pay for a little customer loyalty. How about that? Nancy Cortez, thanks so much. Good to see you.
As a captain for United Airlines, Denny Flanagan's job is to get you safely to your destination. Realizing the negative aspects of airline travel today, he will, when time permits, step out of his environment, the cockpit, and engage his customers, the passengers. It will not be uncommon to see him pushing a wheelchair, speaking with customers, and purchasing meals during long delays. His personal attention to his customers has landed him on the front page of ABC, NBC, and CBS, and the Wall Street Journal. Captain Flanagan retired from the U.S. Navy and had a fulfilling career there. He spent 3 years then with the National Science Foundation in support of Operation Deep Freeze in the Antarctic. He flew a ski-equipped C-130 Hercules and provided logistics support for scientific experiments. In future years, he flew the Lockheed P-3 Orion, whose mission was to maintain surveillance of the Russian submarine fleet, search and rescue ships in distress in the Atlantic, and locate drug runners in the Gulf of Mexico. He is on the board of the Captain Jason Dahl Scholarship Fund. Captain Dahl was at the controls of Flight 93 on September 11th in 2001 when terrorists tragically took his life. The crew and customers prevented the aircraft from reaching its intended target, the Capitol building in Washington, D.C., and as a result, it crashed in a farmer's field in Pennsylvania. To keep Captain Dahl's memory alive and the love of flying alive, the scholarship was started to provide financial assistance to young men and women seeking a career in aviation. And for more information, you can contact the fund at dahlfund.org. That's DAHLFUND.org. Please welcome Captain Denny Flanagan.
Thank you, fellow aviators and aviation enthusiasts. Thanks for having me here to tell my story about being nice. Well, thank you. You know, I get asked many times is why, how, and when did I start doing these things about being nice to my customers? Well, being nice, it's the right thing to do all the time. But I found out the hard way that if it wasn't for the customer, I wouldn't have a job. get everybody from point A to point B. And I didn't much engage with the customers. But it wasn't until 16 years ago on 9/11 that the airline industry took a big hit. Hundreds of airplanes were parked, thousands of pilots were room when you get off this flight and you miss your flight. I said, call me and let me talk to the agent and I'll explain to her what happened, because you are all entitled to a hotel room tonight. Well, I got about 20 calls, and mostly of appreciation, but one was from a young man named Justin. Justin says, Captain, I have my hotel room, but I was on my way to Beijing. I was supposed to meet a professor from Canada with a bunch of other college students, and then the next day we're going to leave Beijing and travel inland China. He said, when I get there a day late, they're going to be gone. What do I do? I said, Justin, give me all your information. Gives me all the information. I call our dispatcher of a headquarters, and I said, I need a phone patch to Beijing. He said, why? I explained it to him. He goes, God bless you, Captain. I'll get it for you right away. I call a hotel, and they connect me. And God was my co-pilot that day because the professor answered the phone in his room. And he was flabbergasted by who he was talking to. And we put together all the information, and for Justin to get his ticket when he got to, he'll have his ticket waiting for him when he got to Beijing. And 3 weeks later, Justin contacts me and says, Captain, I'm back from China, and I met up with everybody, and thank you very much. You can take that and say, no, Justin, just when you get there, just talk to the agent. No. Why pass it on to somebody else when you have everything right in front of you and you can do it yourself if you have an idea how to help somebody? Just don't pass the buck. So I just don't use the word can't. It's not in my vocabulary. Now, the next photo, please. This is what we call an MRD, a maintenance release document. And on the bottom where the arrows are was a little episode that took place on the airplane. The cleaner comes up to me and says, Captain, I dropped my radio down the forward lavatory. And that's the walkie-talkie. You know, it's like a little bit bigger than an iPhone, bulkier. And I said, what are you going to do? She goes, well, I'm going to tell my boss. Well, this is during cleaning. We haven't even boarded yet. It takes 45 minutes to board. So I had plenty of time to get this radio out. So I sent our message off to Boston. It was a Boston flight to San Francisco, 5 o'clock in the afternoon. Business travelers, connections, international connections. And now we board. And now we're ready to push back. They still haven't solved the problem. 10 minutes past departure, we call them. We're working on it. 20 minutes past departure, we're working on it. 40 minutes past departure, that was my co-pilot making the calls. I call. I said, somebody has to come out here and tell me what's going on. So a mechanic walks in front of the airplane. I get out of my seat. I meet him. It's a Boeing 757. You board at door 2 left, just behind first class. And I walk back there to meet him. And I put my blazer on, my hat on, and I said, what's going on? He goes, Captain, the cleaners dropped it down there. They should take it out. I said, follow me. So we walked down the aisle, up past first class, up to the first class lavatory where this radio was. And I looked at the flight attendant. I said, do you have a plastic bag? She goes, sure. I take my hat off. I give it to the mechanic. Take my blazer off. I give it to the mechanic. And I've never done this before. So I put my hand in this plastic bag. I opened the door, and I was a little bit frustrated, so there was some extra energy, thrusting into it. So I push it in, and I hit the radio. It was only 18 inches deep. And it hits the radio, and it scoots off. But now I'm committed. So I kneel down on the floor, and I start squeezing everything softly. So, because I didn't want it to get away, because I had no idea how big this tank was. And the flight attendant just said, I'm going to film this. And there's no way I'm turning my head back around to look at the mechanics and says, what's the dimensions of this tank? By the way, it's 2 feet, 3 feet, 18 inches high. So I'm squeezing everything softly, and I get the radio, and I itch it towards my fingers and pull it towards me. Now, you probably don't know this. You think there's only one purpose of that flapper in the toilet? Well, there's another purpose for it, to catch the captain's hand when he sticks it in there. So I started to pull it out, and that flapper caught me, and I go, oh, shoot, I don't know what I'm going to do. So I ended up taking the pen out of my pocket. And now, you can't repeat this, okay? I moved it, and I dropped the pen in there and pulled my hand out. So it's just between us because I didn't write that up, and I did not want another delay. So. And I didn't want to go back in there. But we do have customers that engage customers, or customers that engage employees. At United Airlines, we have a program called Vacation Donation, where a fellow employee can donate his vacation days to another employee that's in need. Kurt Ledoux, my first officer at United, his wife was pregnant with triplets, and she had a brain tumor. And they delivered the babies at 25 weeks, and they removed 25% of her brain. And so the pilots donated 732 days to him. So he was able to be off work for 2 years with his family. So Kurt's back to work now, and I'm his first flight. And we're on our way to Seattle. And I did my business card thing to the customers, and Kurt, or the flight attendant, calls me up and says, "Captain, we have a note back here for you from one of the customers." And she slips underneath the door, and I read it. It's from Mr. Clark, Stephen Clark, from Gold Bear Seafoods in Seattle. He said, "Captain, thanks for the personal touch. I'd like to return the favor and send you and your family a seafood dinner. Let me know where I can send it." I gave it to Kirk. He read it. He goes to give it back to me. I said, "Oh, Kirk, you keep that. I'll have him send it to you so you can have a dinner with your family, or maybe have some friends over that helped you during this difficult time." After landing, I met Mr. Clark. I told him the story about Kirk. He puts both his hands on my shoulders, and he says, "Captain, you tell the first officer that he can have as much seafood as he wants. Invite as many people as he wants, and I'll send the seafood." Well, he sent Kirk 70 pounds of seafood, 30 pounds of crab legs, 20 pounds of scallops, and 20 pounds of salmon. And Kirk ended up, I was at one of them, he ended up having 3 different seafood gatherings to thank the people that helped him during that difficult time. So every day, by being nice, you have an effect on somebody else. That gentleman turned around and helped Kirk and his family. Now, dear to my heart are the men and women of our armed forces. The airlines, all the airlines, are great at boarding the soldiers in uniform. At United Airlines, we have 13,000 pilots, and we have about 1,300 pilots who are actually serving in the reserves, actually flying in the military. So pilots would take care of these soldiers. They can move them up to first class. The flight attendants could move them up to first class once that door closes. We have customers on the airplane that would buy food for the soldiers that are on board. And I would just like to thank all of you out there, whoever have helped a soldier that's traveling, because when I'm in the concourse, I can see people grab the tab of 2 sailors having lunch and pay the tab, or 2 Marines sitting at a bar, they'll buy them a beer. And when you're in the gate area, I've seen customers go over and give up their first class seat so that soldier can have a comfortable seat. I've only been able to do this 4 times in my career, where I would have a group of soldiers, and I walk up to them as I approach the airplane. I said, "Gentlemen and ladies, would you mind riding in first class?" "Hoorah, Captain." And I says, "But I tell you what I'm going to do. I don't want to embarrass anybody." So I walk over to the agent. I said, "I'm going to move everybody up to first class." She goes, "No, you're not. You're not going to mess with that." I said, "You won't have to do a thing." I grab the microphone. I do my little shtick about greeting the customers and saying hello. And I go, "Ladies and gentlemen, over here are 20 young men of our armed forces who sacrificed their lives to enjoy the freedom and liberties of this great country we live in. If you think your seat will provide them more comfort than their middle seat in coach, feel free to walk over and exchange it 1 for 1. There's hoorahs, hugging, clapping, crying. People are just hugging each other, and every soldier gets in first class. Now, one time I tried to expand on this. There's a colonel back there. I said, "Colonel, how about we let all your men and women off first, line the jetway," because they were on the way back to Afghanistan. And I said, "Well, line the jetway, everybody can wish you well." He was good with that. Well, the thing is, they lined the jetway, and it was like an 800-person wedding reception line. Everybody had to talk to every soldier, talk about every combat mission they were in Vietnam or Korea, what their dad did. And, you know, when you land, you have to make your connection. You have 51 minutes, 30 minutes to make a connection. And so I had to get out there and do some, get everybody, come on, everybody, get moving. Colonel, can you take everybody out in the, you know, out in the jetway area, get them out of the jetway? And so he moved everybody. I've never done that again. That was just, it's something that was a good idea, but it didn't work, and I just never did it again. But, and I'm on this board for the Jason Dahl Scholarship. Captain Dahl and Vic Saraceni, Captain Vic Saraceni, First Officer Leroy Homer, and First Officer Michael Harax at United Airlines lost their lives on September 11th. And the pilots at United Airlines, we started a scholarship. And we give out Leroy Homer Foundation. They give out 2 private pilot licenses a year. The Jason Dahl Scholarship, we gave out 18 scholarship recipients this year. And the pilots, we call it just a buck. So United employees, they just donate $1 per paycheck. And some people give more. But if anybody out there has children that want to be aviators and they want some cash, we have it for you. It's just, you just write essays, why you want to fly. And then we look at your school record and things that you do. But, you know, everybody has their, each scholarship group has their own parameters to how they select them. But the last slide, if you go to the last slide, take your cameras out, take a picture of that with my phone number and the email address, and email me, and I can send you information on the scholarships. And also, if you want a set of those airplane trading cards, I'll send you a whole set, and I'll mail them to you. But through the years, my recipe for success has only a few ingredients. I work from the heart. I choose my attitude every day for the altitude I want to maintain. I anticipate my customers' needs, and I exceed their expectations, and I look through the eyes of my customers. I ask myself, what do they want? Thank you very much. Now, we do have time, if Danny doesn't come out here, we do have time to take questions, if anybody had a question of anything I said. And I cannot, they have microphones walking around? Oh, he's here. I guess I don't have time. Do I have time for questions? One. Oh, one question, okay.
There's one down here. Where does he pick up his pizza?
Oh, no. Okay, we'll take another question. Yes, sir.
Speak up. This is kind of a serious question. General Aviation wants to modernize, not privatize. What do the airlines want to do?
Well, they want to keep it the way that it is right now. They do not want to, we call that open skies, and that's what they're fighting right now, getting airlines from around the world. Now, you can fly to the major cities, but not once you get into the United States, just start flying around the country. They don't want that, and that's what they're working on, both the unions and the companies. Okay, well, thank you very much.
Thanks, sir.
Okay.
I'll pick those up for you after the show.
Oh, okay, thanks.
Dr. Jerry Cockrell is an airline pilot, retired, and an instructor with over 20,000 hours. He's been a licensed pilot since 1965 and a flight instructor since 1968. His type ratings include the Douglas DC-3, the Boeing 737, and the Boeing 747-400. In 2016, he was awarded the FAA Wright Brothers Master Pilot Award. In 2016, he was an inductee into the Flight Instructor Hall of Fame by the National Association of Flight Instructors. He has a PhD in psychology from the University of Mississippi. He's the first person to make an aviation safety speech in every state of the Union. His international safety presentations have been conducted around the world, including England, Germany, Saudi Arabia, the Netherlands, Nigeria, Zimbabwe, South Africa, Mexico, Australia, provinces, 8 provinces and territories in Canada. He's a keynote speaker at the International Symposium on Aviation Psychology at The Ohio State University, and he's the first president of the Alaska Aviation Safety Foundation, which produced and hosted the Hangar Flying PBS TV program in Anchorage, Alaska. He's an early developer of CRM, Cockpit Resource Management. He's a human factors expert in aviation accident cases, and he's an FAA FAST team representative for the Helena, Montana FSDO. And on a personal note, I first met Jerry about 30 years ago. We were on a King Air that was provided by the governor of Virginia to fly us off to do a little speaking for the governor back in Virginia, and we shared that airplane ride together. Please welcome Dr. Jerry Cockrell.
Well, thank you very much, Danny. That was a great read. It's almost exactly the way I wrote that. I got to tell you, it's a great pleasure for me to be here again. I've been so fortunate to have the opportunity to participate here for some time. In fact, I was thinking today the first program I did here at Oshkosh was in 1975, and they had some big old circus tents out on the north end. That was pretty much it. And it's an inspiring thing to be able to come here and associate with people who have like interests, and even though diversified, but we're all here for pretty much the same reasons. By the way, I might mention, this is an important question, and I have to be able to see. How many professional pilots are there out there? Uh-huh. Well, those that didn't raise your hand, I guess what that means is that you're an amateur pilot. Well, you go out to the airport and announce that and see how many people go flying with you. So by the end of this program, I hope to ask that same question and see if I can get you to admit to the fact that you're a professional, because that's how you do your job. It's not necessarily about getting paid for it. It's doing the very best you can with what you got and trying to always be better. Well, we'll see how that turns out. Here I am at the pinnacle of a mediocre career, and well, you know, I got to tell you right off the bat, you could probably figure out already, I'm probably not from around here. Where I come from, we speak the King's English. Elvis. Well, I got to tell this on a buddy of mine. I hate to sidetrack, but I am a little schizophrenic, and I usually come back. But this buddy of mine got out of high school, didn't go to college. He enjoyed heavy equipment operation, and he took that up and went to school for it and did well and applied himself and moved up in this company and became a supervisor and was doing extremely well. But now this fellow hadn't traveled very much out of Mississippi. Might have been to Tennessee once or twice, and maybe Alabama, but not beyond that. At one point, his company merged with another company, heavy equipment up in the Northeast, and his owner assigned him the task of going to Boston, Massachusetts to see to this merger, make sure everything goes smooth. No, I ain't going up there, buildings and people and cars, and no, I can't. Well, your job depends on it, and so does this company, so get with it. Well, his friends all said, well, look, there's some positive parts of this. You go up there, you'll find these universities, big universities, and they all have college pubs around there somewhere, and they're all bound to have some college co-eds, and they are all wealthy, because you can't go to school up there unless you got some money. He thought, well, I'll give it a try. So he went, found the universities, found the pubs, and sure enough, there's some co-eds, and he's nervous as a cat. Finally, he took a deep breath and said, all right. Walked over to this young lady and said, howdy, little lady. You one of them co-eds goes to Harvard? She said, Yale. He said, are you one of them co-eds? Boy hadn't been around much, you know. Oh, well. I got something I need to do. right here off the bat. My father was a fighter pilot in World War II and had a tremendous effect on my attitudes about flying and flying safety. He never did talk much about combat and that sort of thing. He just told me about things that he learned as a 21-year-old person involved in things like that. And Dad came to me, with me to Oshkosh a number of years ago. In fact, I have his jacket here. It's an EAA jacket, and it's got 2 patches on it, 1982 and 1983. And Dad passed away 3 years ago, and I just thought I'd kind of bring him along with me this time. Sorry about that. Anyway, Dad pushed me really hard about getting an education. He said there's going to be a day when it's important for a young man to get a college education. He never even considered that a woman might want to get a college education. You know, some people, and this is true about people involved in aviation, we're rigid. We don't like to be told how to do things. We're kind of rebellious. We're task-oriented. Get her done. That ought to be the name of our game. Well, that's all good, but don't let it paint you into a corner. But my dad was so rigid, and I found out that people involved in aviation, and I can see a little bit, I see some people out there I'd consider to be quite young, and some advanced. Well, as you advance, you get more rigid about things like that, and my dad was never socially or politically correct, and he just never thought about a woman wanting to go to college. And one day I happened to call him up. I was on a little layover someplace, and he said, "So, how's it going?" I said, "I'm good. How are you?" "Fine." He said, "How's your social life?" I said, "Good. I got friends. We do things." I knew what he was driving at, but I was going to make him say it. He said, "How's your love life?" I said, "Well, I've been dating this airline captain." Dead silence. When he finally recovered his voice, he said, "What?" I said, "Well, she's been a captain at United for 4 years." He said, "What?" He said, "They don't let women fly those jets, do they?" I said, "Yes, sir, they do." He said, "Well, I'll never fly on another one. I can tell you that right now." See, some people you're never going to change. There's nothing I could say to him that would change him. But some of the things he told me lasted a long time. And sometimes people involved in aviation, the more you push them, the more they go the other way. I knew I was destined to be in aviation because my dad pushed me so hard about going to college, I just flunked out of high school. By golly. I'll show you. I did. I failed completely out of high school. I'm not talking about just quit going. I'm talking about they stood in the door and said, "We've had enough of this, and so have you. You're out of here." Fine, suits me. I didn't want to be here in the first place. I never have got a high school diploma to this day. I thought about taking that GED equivalency test. They give you a series of tests, and you pass them, they give you a certificate they say is equivalent to a high school diploma. Why didn't you just give me those tests to start with? I wouldn't have to go to school every day. Well, nevertheless, right after failing out of high school, my first night in Saigon, I began having thoughts like, I need to be in college someplace. Sometimes it takes juice longer to get to the light bulb than... Dear old Dad was right all along. I should have paid attention. Well, when I finally got back out of there, I applied to every college I could get an address for. And you can tell by the color of what's left of this hair, computers were pretty new at the time, and one of them glitched and let me in on academic probation. Now, I got to tell you, here's a poor old country boy from Mississippi, been told his whole life, you're never going to succeed, you're just a failure. My first semester in college, I made the dean's list. Well, you're going to say, yeah, which one? Well, it's a fair question based on my history. It was the Dean's Academic Excellence List. My family could not believe it. I mean, my dad wrote a letter to the chancellor of the university and said, "We apologize. Our son has apparently stolen some grade slips." Again, and well, listen, I persevered. I hung in there. I found a happy home. I got a bachelor's degree in it. They had a grand graduation ceremony. It must have been something like graduating from high school, I guess. But it was like a family reunion. Folks came from miles around. We had fried chicken. Dad put his arm on my shoulder and said, "Boy, you did good. What you going to do now?" I said, "Well, I'm going to stay in school." He said, "What?" I said, "I'll get a master's degree." He said, "Sounds good. Go for it." I did. Another graduation ceremony. Not as many families showed up. Still had fried chicken. Dad put his arm on my shoulder. Did good again, boy. What you going to do now? Stay in school. I done been out there. I like it right here. He began wanting to know when I was going to get out and get a job, you know. Well, I wore everybody out. I wound up with a PhD in 3 different areas of psychology. I think I've gotten over that now. But the point of that story is not to try to impress you with credentials, not by any means, because anybody here could go do those things. You can add letters to behind your name if you want to. But the reason for telling you that is I found 3 things that helped me gain at least a little success in one area, academics. 3 things. And I came up with these 3 things because I found out pilots can do 3 things at once. Any more than that, task overload. We're up against it then. So these 3 things are discipline, motivation, having a goal. And I suggest to you that any endeavor that you have, business, interpersonal relationship, career, if you don't have all those 3 things going for you, your chances of success are diminished. Now, I'm not saying you won't be successful, but I'm saying you will enhance your opportunities toward success if you incorporate all 3 of those things. Discipline, pretty easy to understand, not easy to do all the time. Do you always fly by the POH, or do you make up your own POH? Do you know better than the test pilots? Can you carry more weight than the book says? Well, I guess we all have to kind of admit to lapses in discipline sometime, but that'll bite you sooner or later. It'll hurt you. So do it SOP. I understand there's times when you're out there and you're up against the envelope and it's, if I stick to the standard, I'm going to get hurt. Maybe if I fudge over this way a little bit, okay, I got it. There's an occasion once in a while when, yeah, maybe that's appropriate. But if you do it regularly, bad news. Motivation, I'll come right back to that. Having a goal. Every time I go flying, I don't care if it's in a little bitty airplane or a big one, my entire plan is 0 defects. Now, I get big arguments on that because people say, there's no such thing as a 0 defect flight. It just doesn't happen. Well, okay, but what would you accept as reasonable? 4 defects? 2? I'm going for 0. If you set your goal high enough on the tree and you only make it halfway up, you're probably going to be all right. So 0 defects. Try for it, even though people tell you it's impossible. Well, something might break. Okay. And people make mistakes. Well, hello. Yeah, but try to make it 0 defects. Set that goal high. Motivation. Our world is full of negative motivation everywhere you turn. No turning, no stopping, no speeding, no spitting, no... Listen, when's the last time you saw a sign that said, go 80, now, please? Well, from Austin to San Antonio, I guess. I don't know what the accident record is since they opened that road up, but Who knows? The thing is, everything has been so negative. And as Denny told you, and I think it's just fantastic, his positive attitude. You know, if you do one thing or say one word to someone every day, you become the purveyor of positiveness. And that spreads. That will spread to other people. And it doesn't take a big motivational thing. You don't have to give a trophy or a plaque or a letter. You know, if you walk by and say to someone, I'm glad to see you're still doing the same quality professional job you've always done. Do you think that means anything to people? It took 4 seconds to say it. It didn't cost a penny, and you better believe it means something to those people. It's always great to hear, job well done. Well, I got to tell you about negative motivation in a little more detail. My 18th birthday, I got my commercial certificate and flight instructor certificate same day. Now, there's a kind of a thought. 18-year-old guy out there teaching everybody else all he knows about aviation. I'm happy to say most of my students lived over it. Nevertheless, the FBO, 4 days after I got my tickets, FBO called me up and said, hey, Jerry, I got a flying job for you on Saturday. I said, a flying job? He said, yes. Professional aviation. I get paid to fly instead of having to pay to fly. He said, be out here at 0800 Saturday morning. Yes, sir. I was out there at 0630, just like you were. You got to make sure everything's going to go right. Well, the boss beat me out there. He has already been there. He's out on the ramp with his brand new Cessna 182, taking the right-hand door off. Already had some seats out of it. Fortunately, left me one. I went over there and I said, is this some sort of cargo operation? He said, well, sort of. He said, you're going to fly over to that pasture over there, that big old pasture, where those skydivers hang out. You're going to haul skydivers all day long. I said, wait a minute. I never have done that. He said, not to worry. They got a fellow over there called the jump master. He'll tell you everything you need to know. I said, but I've never done that before. Have you ever been tasked with a situation you've no experience, no previous knowledge, not going to get any supervision or help, just get her done? Well, we've all been faced with that, not comfortable. Then the clincher, he said, well, they're going to pay you twice your normal hourly rate. I said, $4 an hour? I'll do it. Now, let's face it. This is the way it is, folks. I'm just telling it like it is. Everybody in aviation, we're all the same. We are all prostitutes. Show me the money. I'll do it. Well, I took off and flew over to that field and landed in that pasture. Never even got the engine shut down. Here comes this fellow over there. He's got an old football helmet, a long time ago, by the way. Football helmet and old scratched up bubble glasses. You couldn't even see his eyeballs. Had parachutes all over him, combat boots. He flopped on the floor in the back of that airplane. And my friends, I can tell you, I can remember it as if it were this morning. He looked in my general direction and said, hi, I'm the jump master. Well, hi, I am the pilot. Don't you, we got an identity crisis here. Don't you hate to go to those restaurants, a guy comes over and says, hello, I'm Tom, I'll be the waiter. Well, hi, I'm Jerry, I'll be the customer. Let's get that straight right now. Anyway, he set up. I said, that's my job. Roar, off we go. And it's real loud now, you know, the door off. And he leaned up by my shoulder and he did like this, 5,500. I got it. Flew up to 5,500, flew away from the field, kind of a little procedure turn, headed back in. On the way back in, he leaned up by me and said, in just a minute, I'm going to step out on that wheel. I'm going to hang on that strut. Now, I want you to watch for my hand signals because I can see better where I want to go than you can. That's straight ahead, left, right. And watch close because when I do this, I want you to cut the power. I'm going to jump off the airplane. I said, Well, that ain't my fault, but go for it. So we get over close to the jump zone. He stepped out on that wheel. He's gone. I said, man, these skydivers is quick. I never saw the throttle back to idle, spiral down as fast as I go. What the heck, $4 an hour. Didn't know a thing about thermal shock in an engine at the time. Wasn't my airplane. Anyway, I landed in that field, and here he comes strutting over there again, putting on another parachute. He flops in the back. He says, up, that's my job. Roar, off we go. On the way up, I got it, 5,500. Went away from the field. Procedure turn, comes back. He got one leg out the door, and it's sort of like old Columbo, you know, he'd never quite leaves it. He came back inside with that foot, and he got real up close to my shoulder. He said, just one other thing. This time, before I get out on that wheel, I want you to hold the toe brakes. I told him I'd never done this before. We have a breakdown in communication. I said, first of all, let me apologize. Did not have adequate information. He said, up. I said, well, we're up. He said, all right, now you got your feet on them toe brakes? I said, yeah. He said, prove it. And I leaned as far back as I could. He put that old football helmet over there and kind of looked under the panel, raised up, kind of looked in my direction, reached up, switched off the mags, pulled the key, and departed the airplane. Talk about your paybacks. Talk about your learning curve. My learning curve's a straight line because let me tell you something. You go flying with me today, you ain't going to believe where I got keys on me. That ain't going to happen to me but one time. Here I am, 18 years old, faced with a sure enough real life, got no engine power emergency situation, and thunk, and then I looked down, it's a huge pasture and the wind wasn't blowing you. How you going to miss? And I just circled around, and sure enough, it was all right. I landed, this time got the engine shut down. Here he comes again, another parachute, another guy with him. They flop in the back. He said, this here's John. He's going for his first skydive. I said, that ain't my fault. He said, up. I said, that's my job. Where's my keys? Cranked up we went. On the way up, I got it, 5,500. On the way to 5,500, he's in the back reading old John his rights or whatever they tell him. I did the turnaround, headed back. He talks John into getting out on that wheel. We get close to the jump zone. He leans out and says, John, go. Oh, John. He tugged on his sleeve. He said, John, go. John. Now, folks, I recognized right then this is going to be one of my trickiest landings ever. With old John on that wheel. Finally, the jump master looked at me and said, John don't want to go. I said, well, he's going, for I know a trick. Well, I just took my feet off them toe brakes. Now, you talk about your motivation. Oh, it was negative motivation, but it was motivation. Because John was so motivated, he stayed with us for about 15 seconds just running on that wheel. I mean, spinning that wheel backwards, smoke coming out of the bearings on that wheel. And it's a pure study in psychology just looking at his facial expressions. It's like, I get back in there, I'm going to hurt somebody, I'll guarantee you. Well, he didn't last all that long. He kind of left the airplane, made a nice jump. I don't know if he was well aware of it or not, but that's negative motivation. Yes, you can get people to do things that you want them to through negative motivation. Absolutely, we all know that. Try being the purveyor of positive and give somebody an uplifting word or deed every day. It'll come back to you and it'll go to other people as well. By the way, psychologically speaking, I know the research shows that 1 out of 3 Americans today needs psychological help. So if you look to your left and right, and they seem okay, why? Well, like I said, you know, we're get the job done kind of folks. Nothing happens until we make the airplane operate. That's fine. And by the way, another research thing, we found this in males between 19 and 22. It's not to say that it's not evident in females as well, but majority we found males between the age of 19 and 22, that part of the brain which is responsible for determining the consequences of any given behavior is not fully developed. And sometimes it lasts longer than age 22. Well, anyway, technology, boy, oh boy, are we overwhelmed with that. It's incredible. Just around this field, you know, 10 years ago, small airplanes didn't have anything like, right now there's some single engine airplanes out here that got more advanced technology on board than some big jets, and they're trying to catch up in the airline industry. And the thing is, when you first encounter that, if you don't happen to be a real computer literate person, I know when we first got glass in the 737s, and by the time I got the 747s, there was plenty of it, but when we first got it, most of us guys had never seen a flat panel glass and all that. We went to a 2-week, not very deluxe school on it. But we got out on the line and had to start doing this stuff. And we asked each other, like, what do you think it's going to do next? I don't know. Don't press enter, it'll do something. And all these young co-pilots, you know, they just literally took command of the aircraft. I'm no longer in command. He's operating the machine. I don't know. Type all you want to. Don't press enter. We had a captain that last got to go to school. He fought it and fought it. He was a steam gauge, pull start engine kind of guy, and he just didn't want to go, but it meant his job, so he went to the school. Couple of days out on the job, he's flying in San Francisco. Weather's right at minimums. They're up a little, down a little. He's kind of in a holding pattern out there waiting his turn. He's watching his fuel. He's going to have to go to the alternate pretty soon. They gave him a shot. Down he goes. Everything is hooked up, auto throttle, autopilot. And you just watch this thing operate, and he broke out right at minimums, and he went punch, and he was trying to disengage the autopilot, but he punched a button that's called the toga switch, take off, go around. So the thrust levers go whoosh, and the nose pitches back up, right back up in there. Tower called him, said, "Sir, you going around?" Guy said, "I guess so." Well, from my point of view, I found that pilots are generally faced with 3 different levels of difficulty when it comes to dealing with flight situations. A level 1 area of difficulty is a routine everyday occurrence for which you have written guidance. It's an owner's manual. It's a federal regulation. It's some kind of, we've thought of this before. We knew it was going to happen, so we wrote it all down, and now this is the answer to your problem. Like ice on the wings. We used to have a really bad icing accident on takeoff. And we finally figured this thing out, and now you get a certain amount of ice accumulation. You pull out a plastic card that says, do this, number one, do this, number two. You don't have to even think about it. Just follow the instructions. That's a level 1 area of difficulty. A level 2 area of difficulty is an emergency, but one that you're prepared to handle because of your training. A lot of people don't like to go to training, particularly some people don't like to go to recurrent training. It says two things to me. One, the training you receive better be right the first time, because that's what you go back to when things get really tight. So early training has to be right on the money, has to be the right stuff. And two, if you're reluctant to go to training, what is that? Where is that coming from? And what kind of attitude is that? You could save yourself by going to training and being sharp all the time. It's not easy to stay current and proficient. It's just not that easy. Well, airline folks have to. Maybe you don't have to. Or maybe you are smart enough to set up a regimen where you absolutely on a schedule say, I'm going to get this, I'm going to redo it until I get it. So it's second nature. A level 2 emergency, let's say, for example, for those of you who fly twin-engine aircraft, a V1 engine failure. And you ask people in an audience of 100 pilots, how many people have ever experienced an actual V1 engine failure, a real one? Why, 4 or 5 hands will go up, and that includes the 2 that are lying. And so it's sort of like saying, well, okay, but how many of you would be prepared to handle a V1 engine failure if it occurred right now? 100 hands go up. Why? I've had the training. I have the confidence. I've proven I can do it. I'm good to go. Got the training. Ask 100 flight attendants in a room. How many of you have ever experienced, had to participate in a real emergency evacuation aircraft on the ground? Maybe out of 100, maybe 1 or 2. But 100 hands will go up when you ask, would you be able to handle it today? Yes. Why? Training. So don't disregard training. It's critical. Now, level 3 problem is an emergency also, but one that you have never even dreamed could possibly occur. Lose all the hydraulics on a DC-10 over Iowa. I had a friend, probably for a long time, maybe one of the only friends he had. I was the only one to listen to him, try to help him out with it. But he was flying a 727, TWA 727 from New York to Los Angeles, 39,000 feet at night. The aircraft yawed a little bit to the right. It's on autopilot. It yawed. He sat up in his seat and slid forward, put his feet on the rudder pedals. It yawed again real hard and then rolled over. Some of you remember this. This aircraft, 737, 39,000 feet, spiraled down toward the earth. The maximum descent rate on the flight data recorder was 39,000 feet a minute. It exceeded the speed of sound. There was no communication. The noise was too great instantaneously. My friend said, well, as soon as it rolled over, I thought, well, we're done. But I'm going to fly. And he tried everything. The controls were slack, completely slack. Nothing worked. He said, well, okay, I've stalled the T-tail. It's not in the relative wind. I've got to get the T-tail out into the relative wind. Somehow I'm blocking the T. How am I going to do that? I've got no control. He reached over and lowered the landing gear. Landing gear comes out, stayed on the aircraft. The right gear, main gear, went outboard a little bit and aft a little bit. The other two were normal position. He began to get some control pressure. and he managed to start getting enough pressure. He pulled back. He said, I'm almost over-rotated. I thought I was going to be the first person to break the wings off a Boeing's aircraft. He said, I almost looped it. I was so anxious to go back up that way. And that was at 4,000 feet AGL. By the way, this aircraft did a circle to land under a 500-foot ceiling and managed to touch down. No one was harmed on the aircraft. The aircraft rolls to a stop. They towed it off to the taxiway. The right main gear collapsed, and everybody was okay. I would call that a level 12 emergency. And by the way, that airplane is still flying. I'm not going to tell you where it is. The last one on level 3, I have a friend who I've known for no sneezing. I have a friend who was flying for Aloha Airlines, Mimi Tompkins, and some of you remember the 737 convertible over there. The top ripped off the 737, 18,000 feet. Tragically, they lost a flight attendant overboard. One flight attendant's badly injured up against the flight deck door. Another flight attendant's on the floor hanging onto the seat attach points, being held down by passengers. Stuff is flying. The pilots, unable to see the true damage, they would have been horrified into inactivity. But they thought the cockpit door was broken, kind of bent open. They thought maybe a bomb had gone off in the biffy or something, and so they just did what they were trained to do, an emergency descent, rapid decompression, down we go. The intention, level off 10,000, go right by the book. You know, there's standard procedures that you do. So while they're going down there, this thing is really getting along pretty good because it's barber pole on the speed, and stuff's flying through. The injuries that occurred were from flying debris. A styrofoam cup going 350 miles an hour can be lethal. I mean, stuff is flying around. They leveled off at 10,000 and discovered then one of the engines is not running. So, what is this, a check ride or what? They managed to land in Maui. Everybody's okay. They came out and looked at the airplane. Well, no wonder that engine quit. Look at all the stuff, the insulation and cups and things in the... Well, that was the one that was running because the other one didn't have enough intake pressure to create all that FOD. So Boeing came out and did a structural analysis and said there were 3 stringers left in the floor of this aircraft. This aircraft was flexing like this, and they said that under normal flight load conditions, this aircraft probably had less than a minute in flight before the flight deck, cockpit broke off from the airplane. Luck. Skill, did what they were trained to do. I mean, the problem with the level 3 area of difficulty is sometimes you got to use your imagination. And boy, that's a little scary knowing some of the imaginations I'm aware of in aviation. Anyway, some people use checklists. Everybody should. Here's something to know about checklists. To go fast, go slow. You may have heard that terminology before. To go fast, go slow. You get in a hurry, you skip something. Where was that? I got to go back and start over. Or just pick it up in the middle somewhere. Maybe I didn't miss anything. Not good. If you're going to do the checklist, and you really need to do the checklist stuff, is stick to it, take your time, get it right the first time. You don't have to go and redo. Okay? Now, I know everybody here that's read any FAA information whatsoever knows about the 5 hazardous thought patterns thing that they came out with. Actually, that was in 1983. I happened to be on an industry task force looking at that research done by Embry-Riddle University and the Ohio State University. Transport Canada sponsored a meeting, and we got all these people from aviation together to try to decide whether we could teach judgment and can we teach better decision making. Well, after 3 days of working with each other, in our judgment, we couldn't make a decision about that. Nevertheless, very quickly, I will reiterate those 5 hazardous thought patterns. So I gave you a test, probably, I don't know what the percentage would be, probably not very many people. The first hazardous thought pattern that we came upon was called the anti-authority hazardous thought pattern. I don't have to do it someone else's way. I know best. I'll do it my own way. Anti-authority, not good. Second is the macho hazardous thought pattern. And a macho hazardous thought pattern means if it can be done, I can do it. Even if it can't be done, I'm in the top 3 candidates. When the going gets too tough for everyone else, it's just about right for me. Now, like I said, macho happens to be a masculine term, and it's not gender limited when it comes to making flight decisions and so forth, because I have seen some female pilots, while trying to establish themselves at an equal level with their male counterparts, sometimes used to anyway, use greater risk than necessary. That's a macho attitude. Well, then there's impulsivity. Doing things too quickly before thinking it through. Oh, I understand sometimes it's no thinking time, it's do time. You don't have an opportunity in every case. Bang, you got to do something. It's not, let's analyze that. You don't always have the time, but when you do have the time, go by procedure, step by step, get it right the first time. Don't shut down the only good operating engine on the airplane, which has happened before and might happen again. Invulnerability is an attitude of, it can't happen to me. I'm just the best there is, so it's never going to happen to me. I study harder, I fly more recurrent training, I'd keep my airplane in perfect shape, I'd do this and that and the other, so it'll never happen to me. Well, I'm not sure that that's a great attitude to have, because it's like, why check the fuel? Either it's in there or it isn't. Why do a walk-around inspection? It flew in here, it'll fly out. No, I don't like that. And finally, resignation. If it's going to happen, it's going to happen. Nothing I can do will have any effect on the outcome. Not good either. Here's a quick way to remember those 5 things. As a kid, I used to hate history, but I later on started reading American history because it put me to sleep. But then I kind of got really interested in particularly studying about the Plains Indians, particularly the Sioux and Cheyenne. And if you study those cultures, you will also find that there is another personality involved that is inextricably intertwined with that culture of people. That would be George Armstrong Custer. And let me ask you this. Those 5 hazardous thought patterns I just mentioned, do you think that on June 25th, 1876, about 55 miles southeast of present-day Billings, Montana, George Custer exercised any of those 5 hazardous thought patterns? Well, like all of them at once. Nobody ever asked you to be the George Custer of aviation, so here's kind of how that flows. The first one I mentioned was anti-authority. Well, George is on this final adventure by special dispensation from President Grant, because he had been court-martialed and was suspended for a year. Court-martialed for what? Disobeying orders. Well, I guess that would be classified as anti-authority. Anti-authority. When he became the second youngest general in the history of the United States Army, they called him the boy general. Think of yourself at this. Brigadier General George Custer, age 23. He created a whole new uniform for himself. Uni meaning form. He wore a bigger hat. He wore a buckskin jacket. He wore a big red tie instead of the standard issue black tie. Just anti-authority. He's going to do it his own way. Macho? Oh, listen. If there was Mr. Macho, it's this man right here. He could run faster, climb higher, dive deeper, and come out drier than any man alive. His troops called him Old Iron Butt. He could stay in the saddle for 20 hours, climb off for an hour, and get back on and do it again. Most of his young troops couldn't keep up with him. Mr. Macho, he was the Renaissance man of the time. He was the popular hit in the social circles in New York and Washington. Impulsivity, well, the one thing that people will agree on, there are two schools of thought, by the way, on George Custer. And they have these clubs today still. The pro-Custer, the anti-Custer. They have newsletters, $5. Give them, you get a newsletter. If these groups ever meet, it's going to be a mess. But one thing they agree on, he was impulsive. He did things that no one expected. When the other side says, we got him on the run, he'd turn around and run back at them. He just never could figure out what he was going to do. On one occasion, riding at the head of his command out across western Nebraska, he saw a small group of buffalo, 10 or 12 as he described them. He hooked off his horse and took off and chased them away over the hill and dale, and there's his troops standing there going, well, there goes our leader. What's he doing? Never said a word to him, no communication. And there he goes. Well, in George's own words, he said, there I was riding along. I singled out this huge bull buffalo. Had to be at least 1,400 pounds. He withdrew one of his Colt Navy revolvers, and he's been playing this bull buffalo. He's a little to the left, a little to the right. Finally, he tires of this activity, so he withdraws one of his Colt Navy revolvers and goes, pow! And shot his horse right between the ears. Now, a brain-shot horse doesn't travel a lot further than where they are right then. The horse goes down, legs fly out, horse tumbles, George tumbles, he rolls up, dusting off. The bull buffalo turns around and says, a little to the left, a little to the right. Well, George had yet another pistol, and he withdraws that, dispatches the bull. Now, he's not concerned about survival from a food standpoint. He's got 1,200 pounds of cavalry horse and 1,500 pounds of buffalo meat, but it's getting kind of late in the day, and he's out there by himself and doesn't know where his troops are. He's got 10 bullets left. By the way, George had not less than 12 horses shot out from under him during the Civil War. We don't know how many to attribute to George. Seemed to show a little tendency there. Nevertheless, he sees a cloud of dust. He figures that must be my guys. The Indians wouldn't make that kind of dust. So he fires 3 shots. They come and collect him. Impulsive. Gets you into trouble. Invulnerability. George went through the Civil War not standing on a hill with binoculars. He led every charge. He was out in front. He had standing orders. Nobody rides past me. He got a scratch on the shoulder and a shrapnel wound on the ankle, and that was it. Facing all of that unbelievable stuff that they had to see and experience, incredible. So he must have felt invulnerable. Had to have felt that way. Finally, resignation. When he rode along the ridge and finally saw the full size of this village, he must have said, let's see, how many have they got? 5,000, maybe 6,000. How many we got? 225. Okay, don't take any prisoners. We got them right where we want them. It's always worked before, always work again. So nobody asked you to be the George Custer of aviation. Catch yourself. And by the way, no excuses. I've made those kinds of I've had those hazardous thought patterns. And when you catch yourself having those, counteract them. Said, well, it could happen to me, but I'm not trying to make you less productive in your flying, but, do it with some reasoning here. Sometimes it's okay to say no on a flight. It's not what pilots like to do. It absolutely we dislike that. But it might be the very best thing you can do for that given moment. Now then, I was supposed to tell you this evening, I do not have the time, They wanted me to tell you about how to do short field landings in a twin-engine aircraft in which neither of the engines currently operating. And to add to that test, we could do it in downtown Atlanta, Georgia. And why not tack on 5 o'clock in the afternoon rush hour traffic? Well, I don't have time to tell you about that, but I sure am proud to be here with you this evening. Nevertheless, I did promise, and I did have several requests before I got started this evening, but I decided I'm going to speak anyway, because a deal's a deal. And fair's fair, and right's right, and wrong's wrong. But I did have someone ask, said they were going to bring someone that hadn't seen this before. You know, I've said in some situations that I thought air sickness was about 80% psychological. And I had a guy jump up one time and say, it's 84%. Well, I don't know. It's always the one in the back seat gets it first. And the one sitting next to him laughs at him for about 10 seconds. Then they get it, and it moves up a row. Finally, the one by you's got their head in the bag. Landlubbers, you'll never make it in aviation. I think we're going to land right down here. I'm not feeling that well myself. It's contagious, you know. It'll get you. Bad stuff. Well, over the years, I have traveling around, as sometimes I hate to do it, flying the back of a jet-propelled aluminum tube. I don't like that, but sometimes I have to. So I started collecting information and looking at the propaganda in the seat backs. And I thought I would share with you a few of my collection of, I got some sick sacks. And maybe you've already had dinner, or maybe you haven't, but I just thought it'd be appropriate. Now, I know you can't see the details very well on these, but I'll tell you what they say. This here is a TWA, long time ago, barf bag. Is a combination 6-sack film mailer, film. It's celluloid. It's plastic stuff that you film mailer, and gin rummy scorekeeper. Say what? Now, can you imagine, here's old Randall and Melba getting on an airplane for the very first time, never been on an airplane. They're going on their first vacation. They got the Instamatic camera. They pull out this thing right here, and it says, oh, look at that. We can send off for films, get that all printed. Look here, gin rummy, we can. And then you start reading, there's 5 lines of detailed symptoms on air sickness. And it starts with for motion discomfort. How will they know what that means? Call a flight attendant who will give you a graphic description. Maybe even show you someone in progress. Bad news. Eastern Airlines also had a film mailer. Theirs was $1 more than TWA's. And if you ever got your film back, it would probably be damaged by an O-ring leak that was an age check. At any rate, on the back of this bag, I have never been able to get my eyes to focus on this. They have a design. Why? They have a design on the back of this bag. It's a paisley design. Now, if you ever even thought, feeling a little woozy, perhaps I'll... Whoa, boy. Well, a bunch of the pilots I knew went back to Eastern. They said, Frank, we got to change our barf bag. This guy's on TV showing our barf bag. We got to change it. So they did. They completely removed the film mailer. And they enlarged and painted brown the paisley design. U.S. Air. First-time flyers do anything they're told to do. They're so nervous. It says right here, after use, fold toward you. National Airlines. This has to be the family model. Boy, there's a message here. Air Midwest. Open and close along the colored line. Okay. Close the bag by holding one edge of the bag and slide your fingers across the bag seal. It's a Ziploc. I got it. As an airsick bag, open and used, then seal bag closed. Bag may be opened again. Bag may be refrigerated. As an in-flight pillow, open bag at one end and blow air into it unless already occupied. Piedmont Airlines, they were struggling financially. I went on this flight. They were struggling so much the co-pilot didn't even go. But flight attendants having nothing to do, I regaled them with my barf bag routine, which they allowed was clever, but they said you couldn't say a thing about our barf bag. It doesn't have a word on there to misguide or mislead anyone. I pulled out this very barf bag. I said, well, you're right, nothing on there, but I'll open it. And when would you discover that? Some mean-hearted person. Air Vietnam, where'd that come from? Delta, they had a company logo, clear explicit instructions, 3 languages, large letters, only misspelled one word in Spanish. I thought, well, that's pretty good. But I was on Piedmont a week or so ago. I thought I'd better this bag is hermetically sealed. It came that way from the factory. When the time comes, it's like no time to go looking for another bag. The only thing this is good for is fanning or scraping. Last one, my student training device. This was made for me by a United Airlines captain that I used to know, and my student training, one size fits most folks. The arm holds at the top, the leg holds at the bottom. If I notice the slightest hint of nausea, I just reach over, pull this string, and close it in over the top of their head. Learning curve. Lock it all up in there with them. No fuss, no muss. Now, I know everybody in here's got airsick stories very quickly. I've got to hustle through. I did have this one situation. A guy came out to the airport. It's going to be his third lesson, and by the time you got 3 lessons, you're instructor proof already. But anyway, I'd been listening to Unicom. It was horrible turbulence out there. Nobody's wanting to fly. There's people out there getting banged around. It's just not good, and especially for lesson 3. And he came into the office and said, I'm ready for lesson 3. I said, not today. We'll do ground school. He said, what's the problem? I said, too much turbulence. He said, well, maybe for you. Now, see that trap we pilots get into? He said, I was in airborne. I've been in every kind of turbulence in airplanes and jumped and all that. But, you know, if it's too much for you, we can sit down and do ground school. I said, here's the book and the key, do the pre-flight. Second mistake, we took off and flew downwind away from the airport. Takes longer to get back. I said, give me a left turn. He does. I said, give me a right turn. He does in the middle of the right turn. It was banging us. I mean, everything. And he took his hands off the controls, put them on the glare shield. I said, you okay? He said, mm-hmm. Mm-mm. I said, do not move your head when you talk to me. I have the controls. We're going back to the airport. We're going along okay, but still getting beat up. And all of a sudden I hear this, Man, I reached for my hip pocket where I always carry my little standard issue blue flight instructor 6-sack. Not there. Change jeans, glove box, no, nothing in there. Side pockets, no. Seat backs, no. Nothing in that. Not even an aeronautical chart you could roll up into one of them cones. And don't forget to turn the end of it up. Learning curve. And he goes, At one point, we were in a Cherokee 140. At one point, I thought about opening that little side window and pressing his face out there. Those students come back from flying lesson, they got a crease around their face. We were on oxygen the whole time. Finally, I said, man, hang in there because we're on a base leg right now, kind of a wide base, about 14 miles. But we are gaining on the airport. He started that noise again. Just that morning, I had just bought myself a brand new John Deere baseball cap. Maybe it was the color. I had to sacrifice my cap. I took the cap off. And I said, well, here, if you got to go in this cap. He put it under his chin, felt a little better. Till I turned from base to final, he said, I think I shut that mouth. Boom, I landed on the taxiway, skidded off in the dirt, shutting things down, opening doors, and got it to a stop, and I rolled the door open, and I got backed out of that wing, and I said, get out of there. And he got one leg out on the wing, and then he kind of started sinking back. I said, no, get out, come to me. He gets down off the airplane. Yes! He walked about 3 steps and went, bah! Well, I don't know. There's only about 20 more hours of stuff I got, and I know we don't quite have enough time for that this time, but you know what? I'm just overwhelmed every time I come here with the generosity and the acceptance that you folks have come out and sit here and listen to an old guy like me droning along. By the way, they call this, Danny started it, called it Evening with Champions. He didn't know I'm liable to show up. I am not the champion of anything. The man in front that talked to you, Denny, well, he's a champion, and the guy coming up next is certainly one too, and I know you're going to have a great time listening to them. I just wanted to mention in closing, carelessness and overconfidence are more dangerous than accepting a known risk. That's a quote from Wilbur Wright. Kind of had it figured out early on. And I remember telling Orville, you better watch this Wilbur. He's going to try to take over. Well, I discovered that sometimes there's a difference between success and happiness. Success is getting what you want. Happiness is getting or wanting what you get. And by the way, how many professional pilots are there out there? Oh, yeah. Oh, yes. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Well, how about that? Now, for me, success is getting through this presentation without folding up. My knees were knocking so bad when I came out here. I do this all the time, but it scares me every time. The happiness part is having the opportunity to once again to deal with people of the same kind of heart and the same kind of interest and joy of life that you and I share, and nobody can beat that. And I would like to finally say thanks to my parents for making it possible for me to be here, and thanks to my ex-wife for making it necessary. Y'all have a great air show. Thank you very much. God bless. Thank you. Thank you.
Dick Rutan may be best known for his nonstop around-the-world voyage in the Voyager. However, he was also a fighter pilot flying 2 decades in the Air Force. He flew 325 combat missions in Nam. 105 of those flights were with the high-risk Misty operations. One of his last missions over North Vietnam, 1986, he was hit by enemy ground fire and rescued by a flaming, he was rescued by a Jolly Green Giant after bailing out. Before retirement in 1978, he was awarded the Silver Star, 5 Distinguished Flying Crosses, 16 Air Medals, and a Purple Heart. His Vietnam Saved by the Silk was not his last life-saving parachute jump. Dick went on to have 2 more adrenaline-pumping parachute jumps from injured aircraft. His second was on final approach during a flight test. His third was leaping from a rapidly deflating and tearing Hilton balloon in the round-the-world race. And he seems to have more in common with Indiana Jones than he does with the average pilot. We give you Dick Rutan.
Well, thank you. Wow. The light went in my eye, I could see who you are. Now let's see, I'm supposed to give a little overview. We're going to talk about well, a few anecdotes. And I'm going to tell you a secret I haven't told anybody in 30 years. 30 years, never told anybody. And after I finish telling you that little story, you'll understand why. You know, I was asked to do a wedding for a friend of mine the other day, and with 18 minutes and $15 or $35 on the internet, you can become a clergy. And so I did. And it was in Minnesota, Missouri, actually, real nice place. And there was some very nice. I had it out on a nice lawn, out on a nice lawn, and a couple young kids getting married. Thought that was really cool. Anyway, I've never done a ceremony. Anybody ever done a ceremony that are non-clergy? Yeah, there you go, a few of them. So anyway, I did that, and so I'm kind of nervous. Hadn't done this before, and you have to get it all in the proper sequence and stuff, and I'm kind of concerned about that. And there was a lot of people there, none of them I knew. And so I was standing there feeling pretty important. And pretty soon this young girl, she was giving me the eye. I thought, wow, it's pretty neat. Maybe the girls here in Missouri, they like older guys. And so pretty soon she walked up to me and she said something that was kind of low tone, and I couldn't really hear what she said, but I was thinking, wow, that's pretty neat. Having somebody like that pay attention to an old guy. So I bent over to hear better what she said, and she said, Mr. Rutan, your fly is open. And sure enough, it was. So I didn't have to stand there and do a ceremony of a wedding with my fly open. Now, I was very interested in listening to the speakers about decision making and so forth. Quite interesting. Anyway, I'm not going to talk too much about the Voyager because I think after 30 years, I've told all the stories all the time. Anyway, let me tell you the secret that I had that I've never told anybody. Now, The Voyager project was here I go talking about the Voyager. But anyway, the Voyager project was a long project, and we didn't have any money, and it took about, actually 5.5 years from the time Bert said, hey, I think we can fly around the world and build it out of carbon, to the time that we actually were successful. And without having any money, you spend a lot of time trying to do volunteers and trying to talk people into giving you some radios and carbon fiber, and the volunteers showing up. So it's kind of like 5 years of herding cats. It's a lot of pressure. Anyway, we got the airplane at the flight test, and the airplane was down for a while, and there was, I don't know, an engine problem, but it was going to be out of commission for a little while. And something really strange happened to me. Now, I've always had aquaphobia. It's kind of like a fear or edge phobia. Aquaphobia is fear of heights, but I never had any problem in an airplane. It seemed to be totally separated. Never had any of those symptoms. But I had edge phobia. Walk over to an edge and look over, and boy, whoa, you get really nervous, and almost to the point of being debilitated. Now here I am. I'm the pilot. I'm the manager of this whole thing, and there's a lot of years gone by. The airplane has been built. We've had a lot into this thing. The airplane was such a horrible flying airplane that I figured that only a world hero velvet arm test pilot could even fly the airplane. So it's kind of a key thing. And it took off one day in my long easy, and I love flying an airplane. It's really neat, having a lot of fun in it. And it took off one day in Mojave. Started to turn out of traffic, and I just bent the wing, just a little turn, and I looked over, bam. All those symptoms, a debilitating phobia hit me. Now, I've always heard about people with phobias. I never give it too much, I just thought maybe they're sissies. Somebody's scared of going outside. It's a sissy. Well, I'll tell you what, that phobia hit me so hard. My skin was cold and clammy. My heart was racing like mad. I couldn't bank the airplane at all. I was virtually debilitated for a phobia. And I don't know how in the world I ever got the airplane back on the ground, and I damn near crashed it. But I landed, taxied back, and I thought, this is not good. There's a lot dependent on me, on this thing. First of all, I can't tell anybody about that. So I was in kind of a quandary about how to handle that. But this big edge phobia had manifested itself in flight. And lo and behold, maybe it was in a bar someplace. I was talking to somebody, and he happened to be a psychologist, and he was asking him about fear of flying and stuff, and he says, oh, yeah, I run a clinic. I run a clinic about people who have fear of flying. And so I says, oh, really? Clinic. How long does it take? Well, about 2 weeks. And so he was very forthcoming, and I asked him the details. I says, well, what do you do with this thing? What are the symptoms? How do you handle all that stuff? And so, and he told me the whole program. And boy, I was taking mental notes, really good. But I couldn't tell anybody about it, and I sure as hell wasn't going to go to his clinic. So I had to do it all myself. And it was a long aspirated thing. You come up to the edge, and all the symptoms are going like mad. You're standing there shaking, your heart races, and you're just virtually debilitated. He says, what you do is you concentrate on one part of your body, and you make it relax. It took 20 minutes. I stood there, and I finally got one elbow to relax. The next time I did it, it took only 10 minutes to make it relax, and pretty soon I could go up and make that part of it relax, but everything else was going to heck. And so finally, after doing it again and again, I could get this elbow to relax, and I said, okay, now I'm going to work on this one. And as soon as I start working on this one would take off again. So long story short, it's left elbow, right knee, left knee, controlled breathing, and so forth. And I went through this whole thing, and I did it myself. And now I have absolutely no fear of any kind of heights. I can hang off the edge of the Grand Canyon. It doesn't bother me at all. Strange how that is. A psychological thing. And I had a lot more sympathy for people who have debilitating phobias. And I wasn't going to tell anybody about that. I didn't think that anybody would ever fly with me again. So anyway. Well, at the end of this thing, I'm going to. Anybody been to the North Pole? Anyway, I have a little movie clip about a little trip we took to the North Pole, and happened to be filming it. And long story short, when I get to it, but the long and the short of this is that there's an airplane at the bottom of the Arctic Ocean, and I just happened to be filming the whole thing, and it's kind of interesting. You know, we talked about, I was very interested in the program, and I'm kind of a pseudo-psychologist, and we had a PhD of psychology, and I'm a little high school psychology. But about human factors, and human factors are very interesting about what can happen to you sometime. You wanted me to talk a little bit about flying, how we started flying. Well, I was a little kid, and I kind of, my first memories that I could remember is about World War II, and I became very fascinated about those guys that flew, especially in combat, out of East Anglia, England, over the skies in Nazi Germany, with the B-24s and the B-17s, where they had loss rates of only, you know, like 3 out of 4 were casualties. Wow, that's a hell of a loss rate. I couldn't figure out how in the world those guys could ever do that again. Then I read about these guys that go out and their whole squadron is shot down, and they're the only one who gets back, and they're all shot up. And how do you get in another airplane the next day? Wondered how that would be. And the guy told me about, he talked about motivation and curiosity. But when you first went out in life, you look around in life and you think, well, what in the world do I want to do? What do I want to accomplish? And after my mother took me for a flight, which turned out to be the EA chapter number 1 in Riverside, or what is it, Fleabab? Back those days, it was just a little grass field, and I think it was a J5 Cub, and somebody got out and woke up the gerbil and spun the propeller. And I still remember a couple things about that. I remember that there was no tread on the tires, and they wanted me to sit down, and my mother and I got in the back, and this pilot was going to fly me for a little airplane ride, and my mother, which I don't know how in the world they could ever afford it, because they didn't have 2 nickels to rub together. But I got in there, and I sat down, and I couldn't see out, you know, little kid. And so I stood up, and I said, I want to look out the window. And I wouldn't sit down. So I was holding on to the back of the pilot seat, and I can still remember the worn leather and the stuffing that was musty and the smell of it. But we took off and bounced out across that field and climbed over there for a handful of minutes over Riverside, California in those early days. And what that little kid saw would change his life forever. Right now, he has an absolute total fascination for aviation. And Mom says that we weren't issued a birth certificate, we were issued flight plans, my brother and I. Had aviation fuel instead of blood for our veins. But the good part of that was that there was an intense interest for that. And for the 2 Rutan brothers. One of the brothers was interested in designing things, and the real good-looking one, he wanted to go out and fly combat and stuff. So. But unfortunately, that fascination with aviation was at the expense of a more rounded character development. Knew a lot about airplanes, didn't know anything about sentence structures and so forth. But one of the curiosities that I wanted to know, I kept reading books about these individuals and what they did, those heroes in World War II. And I wondered how in the world, could I do something like that? Fascinated about that. My mother took me to March Air Force Base as a little kid, and they had an open house, and they went into the military. And I remember walking in there, and I'm looking at an RF-84F, and the guy's standing there really cool. He got his G-suit on, really a cool-looking guy. And and for the air show, instead of the camera windows, they had scantily clad females. And I thought, wow, at least this guy knows what he's fighting for. And I looked up at that, and my mother says, Dick, how would you like to fly one of those things? And oh boy, I tell you what. First of all, I thought the guy was from a different planet. He wasn't even for the same species. And for little Dickie Rutan to ever achieve something like that was impossible. It was totally out of the question. And I says, wow, oh, sure, I would really like to do that. But then I told her that, Mom, I don't think I could ever achieve something like that. And my mother grabbed me by the neck, about as hard as I can remember, and she said, if you want to do that, you can. And she gave me the confidence to go and try to do something like that. Anyway, I went to pilot training, graduated top of my class, because when I went into pilot training, I was already a flight instructor. It's kind of like having a head start. And had this curiosity about whether I could do something like that. What would happen to me in combat? Had to find out. And after going through getting my first choice, the F-100 slightly supersonic Super Sabre, I was standing in the Luke Officers Club about graduation. In those days of 1967, there was a lot of guys coming back from combat, a lot of guys getting trained up, and they were going. And so the camaraderie and the debauchery was something quite unique. That day I was standing not in participating too much of it, because I was standing back trying to reflect back on all those days. To do something significant as a pilot, I was going to find out whether little Dickie Rutan could actually fly in combat. And I thought, because of my mother, that gave me the motivation to stay and do that. I want to go out and play with my friends. And she would say, Dick, remember that jet fighter? And I sit up there back in the 50s, and I see those contrails going over, and that guy was so high in the sky I couldn't even see it. But I knew that there was somebody at the end of that contrail that had one hell of a view, and I couldn't wait to get there. I had a set of orders to combat in an F-100 at Phuket Air Base, Republic of South Vietnam. And I thought there was not another place that I wanted to be, another person I ever wanted to be than right then at right then. And I was going to find out if I could do that. And of course, a lot of you that have been in combat, I always ask a lot of them, what happened the first time somebody shot at you? What was your reaction? Did you duck down? Did you want for your mother? Did you turn away? What was your first reaction? And what I found is that after talking to a lot of my colleagues, it's almost a universal reaction. And in the first few missions, you couldn't tell anybody that was ever shooting at you or anything. But I rolled in on one target one day, and I looked over there, and there was a .50 caliber. The guy was really good, and he had a long string of tracers, and those tracers were coming right over my canopy. And what you would do in the next millisecond will define you as a warrior. And the first reaction was the audacity of that son of a gun to shoot at me. The audacity of him. And then the second thing that's kind of natural, and that is it probably gets you killed. And it was, well, I'll fix you. And so I rolled in on this gun sight, and it ignored my target. And the flight lead says, Rutan, what are you doing? I says, well, I said, I'm going after that gun. He says, get the hell out of there. What are you doing? And I says, but sir, he shot at me. And he saved my life. But then I got to find out what it was like to be a warrior. And then I had a better understanding of how those guys would do that. he talked about motivation. The doc, very interesting, really great, and I really enjoyed his form. And he talked about the motivation. Now, I was the same kind of guy. I was maybe a plus A student, knew a lot about airplanes, struggled a lot of other things. And I just barely got through high school and went into the Air Force. But then as time went on, I was going to be promoted. And pretty soon you get into the field grade ranks, or major and lieutenant colonel, and you realize to do that, you had to have a college degree. And I missed out on college. I didn't get to go and chase girls and drink beer and raise hell. And I missed the college experience. All of my college was sitting in alert, sitting on a thermonuclear weapon in a forward base in a bunker someplace, all suited up, ready to carry that thing someplace on the other side of the Iron Curtain, studying. That was my experience. But anyway, they had a bootstrap program. You had to graduate from a recognized college, at least for a semester. And so anyway, there was this college called, it was in Killeen, Texas, Killeen, may have heard of it, called American Technological University. So I went down there, and I was really scared, because here I was, I had a family. If I flunked out, look what the heck was going to happen to me. This is going to be terrible. The humiliation of trying to go back to my unit, having flunked out. And the motivation was, and I ended up on the dean list. I had a 4.0 average. Little Dickie Rutan had a 4.0 average. And it's all to do with motivation. And motivation is an important thing. And I try to remind myself that back in the early 60s, there was a person that understood motivation for his country. And he was a young president. And he stood up one day and he says, hey, we're going to go to the moon. Wow, that's an exciting thing to do, right? We're going to go to the moon. Think we could do that? We hadn't even been in orbit yet. Another thing he said was, we're going to do it in this decade. He said, wow, that's a short time period. And then he wrote the check and stood back, and look what happened. One of the greatest things our country ever did. And another thing that was really important that he said, besides the motivation and the short time period, he says, we're going to do it, not because it's easy, because it's hard. Now, it worries me a lot that I don't see a lot of progress. I walk through the mall some days, and I notice that a lot of the youngsters are in the mall. They have a kind of a little bump on their head, some of them little Band-Aids. You've seen it sometimes. They try to figure out why this is a pervasive minor injury with a lot of these kids. And then I got to watching them, and I figured it out. It's because they're working that cell phone all the time, and they're running into stuff. I like to put things in a historical perspective. Historical perspective, very important. Another thing, there's Arthur C. Clarke had one of his three rules to live by, and one of them is, the third one I like the best, and that is that he says, if a noted graybeard scientist would stand up and declare that something is possible, he's probably right. But if the same respected graybeard scientist, curly-headed guy named Albert, you may have heard of him, if he stands up and says that something is impossible, he's almost certainly wrong. Like the speed of light. You can't go faster than light speed. If you go so fast, right at the speed of light, you get so short, you disappear. Your mass becomes greater than the mass of the universe, or infinite mass, at the same instant that your clock stops. Well, if that's not a definition of absurdity, I don't know what is. And if you believe that, we're never going to explore the cosmos. Think about this. How'd you like to go into a place in the future? You go into this building, and this building it has a whole bunch of tunnels in it, right? A bunch of tunnels. And over the top of this tunnel, it would say some star cluster in some nebula, or the Orion Nebula. And you walk through this thing, you get in this thing, and it shakes a little bit, and you get out, And you walk out, and there you are. You're in that nebula, or in that place. How many think that that is really an absurd thought? Do you think that we could do something like that? Historical perspective. The year is just a very short period ago, and it's 1840. And in 1840, we're going to roll in next to a guy and his family. He's got a couple of kids, and he's in a Calistoga-covered wagon, and he's out in the middle of Iowa, and he's heading for the Oregon Territory, and it's going to take him the better part of a year to get there, right? And you roll in beside him, and you start telling him about something. Now, here a guy's taking a full year to get to someplace. No electricity, none of that. Didn't even have soap, I understand. And you roll in and tell him about a place. I says, hey, let me tell you about a place in the future. It's a big building. You walk in this building, and they have a whole bunch of tunnels. And on the top of every one of these tunnels, it has a city. It says Paris, Los Angeles, Philadelphia. And you walk in this tunnel, and you get in this machine, and it shakes a while, and then it stops shaking, and you walk down another tunnel, and you're in Paris. What do you think he would have thought? See, nobody's dreaming enough. I tell people that if somebody says that there's something impossible, or there's a limitation or hate fences, he says they're probably almost certainly wrong, and you never should look at it as something to abide by. Look at it as a target of opportunity for greatness. You got to dream a little bit. I just love people like my brother. All the things that he did around the world, Voyager flight, made the first civilian space out of a crummy little desert town in the high desert of California. And he says, if I can't find 50% of the people that are knowledgeable about what I'm trying to do would say that, Bert, there's no way that that's going to happen. There's no fine way that that's possible. He says, if I can't find them, I haven't set my sights high enough. And back in 1980, before we had, if you wanted to make a phone call, you had to find this box, and it had a wire hooked to the wall. That film, never mind. No GPS, none of that. And he come up and says, hey, I think we can go around the world with carbon fiber. Let me tell you another anecdote, too, that I just thought about. He's the consummate visionary. And I always, my input to a lot of this stuff is that, hey, Bert, you're going to do what? There's no fine way that's going to happen. But a lot of times it does. And another thing about Bert, or a visionary, is that about a third of everything he's tried is an absolute disaster. And a lot of people are debilitated by the fear of failure. A lot of you out there are, a lot of people, well, most of all of you all have dreams about something you'd like to accomplish. And here's what generally happens. You're talented. You think, wow, I'd like to do whatever your dream could be. And then you make the mistake of trying to figure out all the possible problems you have along the way. And all of a sudden, if you can't figure out something that you foresee may be a problem in the future to get to your destination, you don't ever try. You talk yourself out of it. Nobody ever asked me at all, I never asked Bert at all about whether we could actually do this or all the problems we were going to have. And if I found out that if I just recognized even 10% of the problems that we had, I would have never started. I would have never talked myself out of it. And that's something I've been trying to write a book for quite a while. And sure enough, I try to write the book, and I say, well, how am I going to handle this? Or how do I handle my ex-wife? Or all the other issues that you talk about when you're trying to write a book. And then one day it hit me. I said, Rutan, you made exactly the same mistake that everybody did. And somebody says, hey, if you want to write a book, sit down and just write it. Ignore everything else or any other problem. Write it how you understood it. And I was really kind of mad at myself because I says, hey, that's the mistake I made. So I sat down in 10 days, wrote the book, and it's in final edit right now. And it was easy. And all those problems, they worked themselves out anyway. Motivation. Anybody ever heard of Tony LeVere? Tony LeVere was Kelly Johnson's test pilot. I remember as a little kid, I read his book, and he was the guy that was out of the 1930s, and he flew, did a lot of testing of airplanes. And Tony LeVere died in the age of 95 or something. He died in bed. And I had an opportunity to hang with Tony one day in his later years. And there had been a celebration at Edwards Air Force Base for they were honoring 5 different pilots. And before the year went out, 3 of those pilots were dead. I says, Tony, how in the world did you ever survive all that stuff? And I remember, like I said, I was reading his book, and he says, well, I really wanted to fly, but I realized that I had bad eyesight, so I couldn't be a fighter pilot. And he says, then I had a bad heart, you know, and he says, then I realized I couldn't be an airline pilot. He said there was only one thing left for him to do, a test pilot. And that always made, I give a talk at the graduation class for one of the Air Force test pilot school classes. That made him feel good. I says, hey, Tony, tell me how in the world that you were able to survive? And he told me something so important, and I think it's probably saved my life more than others. And he says, Dick, as a test pilot, he says, do not worry about the high-risk flights, the dive flutter test or the high angle of attack and stall departure. Don't worry about all those things, because there's a lot of people involved in the project, and they are going to do all the worry, and they're going to do all the ones, the what ifs and so forth. He says, don't worry about that. He says, the one that you should worry about, the more mundane it is, the more attention that you should give to it. Because complacency. If you're going to go out and do sawtooth climbs, it's not a big deal. There's no risk involved in that. And maybe somebody didn't fill the fuel tank or something. Complacency. And I was going to fly over to get some special fuel over another airport. I was climbed in my airplane, and I says, yeah, it's a short flight. I wouldn't even bother to put my seatbelt on or anything. And I got in there, and I was going to start the engine, and then the little voice of Tony LeVere got out. So I got out of the airplane, and I did the most thorough pre-flight, even got the checklist out and read the checklist, because this was a really mundane flight, and I had to be careful. A couple other things is dangerous flights. In my opinion, there's 2 flights that are really, really dangerous, the most dangerous ones you can have. And one is, if you point a camera at a pilot, he's almost guaranteed to do something really stupid. And another dangerous flight is an unscripted joyride to find yourself. And I just lost a real good friend the other day, an unscripted joyride. And so you should look at those as really high-risk flights. Decision-making again. I had an opportunity to fly a rocket-powered airplane. How many of you have flown a pure rocket-powered airplane? So anyway, there was a company called X-Corps, and they were developing rocket motors, and neither one of them were pilots, but they were rocket scientists, really clever guys, and they wanted to have some ideas on how to do liquid fuel rocket motors and make them safe and reliable, and that was their task. And they thought they'd like to demonstrate one, and there's some guy crashes Long Easy, and they rebuilt it, and they put 2 rocket chamber motors in it. And the back seat was full of liquid oxygen. It's bad stuff. And they had a big pylon on the centerline pylon, and it was full of I think, kerosene or alcohol. So they had an oxygen. This is a real no-kidding rocket-powered airplane. And they says, hey, Dick, how would you like to be the test pilot for our company? And I says, wow. Now, these guys were just starting up. They didn't have any money, and they had hawked their cars, and their credit cards were maxed out. And I always had a soft place in my heart for somebody that I thought was very talented, but with no means, especially in Mojave. Mojave, our kind of policy is there, if you got a good idea, you have the freedom to come and try. And you also have the freedom to fail or bust your tail. And as long as you give that opportunity to somebody, you know, some of those things are going to turn out pretty good. Some of them not. So I says, wow, so I'm not getting paid anything, but just the thrill of flying a rocket-powered airplane. So I says, well, since I don't have a dog in this hunt, it's not my company, there's nothing on the line for me, I'm just, so I come up with a protocol. And I says, now, to minimize my risk. And so they tow the airplane out and they refuel it with the cryogenic, the real cold liquid oxygen, and fuel it. And then they're going to test, they're going to test the rocket motors. And so I says, well, I tell you what, one of you scientists are going to get in the cockpit and you're going to run each one of the chambers for 2 seconds. Turn it on, 2,000, and turn it off to make sure it'll start and shut down, right? And Dickie Rutan is going to be in that ditch over there, and he's going to be hiding behind that pickup truck, see? Anyway, if you're involved in rocketry, a lot of times you go out, something's wrong, and you come back. You go out, something comes back, and back and forth and so forth. And so I come up with this protocol that those guys were going to do that. But anyway, we've been out a couple of times back and forth, and for some reason I found myself sitting in the cockpit. And my protocol test had not been completed. And then, you know, you get in the airplane and you're all strapped in and you got the headset on and you're all plugged in, you know, you just, then I remembered, hey, we haven't done the 2-second test. He said, no, it's okay, Dick. He says, because we have done a thorough leak check. There should be no problem. Go ahead and do it. And I said, darn, I shouldn't do that. So they tell me that there's 3 things that can happen in rocketry. One is that it blows up when the engine starts. You know, a lot of sequences have to happen just right. And it blows up when it starts, and it blows up when it's shut down. Now, a lot of them, when they shut down, the sequences and the lines don't purge just right and so forth. A lot of stuff have to happen, and they can blow up there. But another thing is sometimes, Dick, we get them started, and we can't shut them off. So I'm at the end of the runway. We're getting ready to go, and I'm holding the brakes. Got the brakes on. And so I turn on. We have 2 little switches, and they're called loud and really loud. So I turn on the first one, hold the brakes. And sure enough, it won't shut off. So I got this engine running, and you know, I can't jump out because the Mach 5 fly will cut me in 2 as it goes by. And so, I've learned my emergency procedures, and we have a manual shutoff system, an emergency shutoff that it's in a firewall valves, and it's a manual handle. So, and the manual handle, it didn't work either. And so pretty soon, one of the rocket scientists come over. And so I show him the switch, the handle. And so you ought to see one of these rocket planes. There's nothing that you recognize in aviation, the valves and switches and all that stuff. I think maybe an airspeed indicator and an altimeter. Everything else is foreign. And so then he reaches in and he starts throwing a bunch of other switches. And finally depressurized, and the rocket motor shuts down. And then there's a pop. And what they do, they shut off the liquid oxygen, but to cool their chamber, they didn't want to hurt their chamber, and so they left the kerosene running or the alcohol running. So it's peeing like a cow peeing on a flat rock out the back, and it catches on fire. Now I'm sitting in the cockpit, you know, and I feel this heat surge, and I can see some weird reflections that I'm reflecting, see? And then, but the biggest thing is, I see everybody standing around me, their eyes are about this big, and they're going backwards. See? They're all pedaling backwards. And so anyway, I pop out of that airplane like a cork in a bathtub and put a good 50-yard dash on it. And when I turn around and look, I see it looks like the whole back end of the airplane's burning. And then I remembered all that liquid oxygen that's there, and so I put another 50 yards. Anyway, one good thing about that is that the fire engine is right there, and he comes and he puts it all out. And so I'm standing there, you know, and I shouldn't be too upset because it's my own protocol that I violated. And he walked up and very sheepishly, he says, "Dick, it appears that we've had a double malfunction." Now, the Easy Rocket is really a lot of fun because you're really heavy, like 3 times your gross weight for this long Easy. And you light the rocket chambers, and everything's working good, and they have to look at the color of the flame, and you're accelerating like mad. You let it go almost to the red line, you rotate, and then you climb. And it's kind of like romantic times you've had in high school, is it's very exciting, but it doesn't last very long at all. And every landing that you have is going to be a dead stick landing. And I figured with all my experience flying those airplanes and a 3-mile-long runway, that's really not a big thing. So it's kind of a routine thing. But one of the greatest things that in the whole program that you want to hear is you got a clean shutdown. Now remember that it blows up on startup and there's a big fire truck there. But when you're a couple miles straight over the airport, you're a long ways from a fire truck. And so when the pressures start fluctuating, you reach up and shut those chambers off. And then you wait for the word because they're watching you. It says, "Dick, you got a clean shutdown." Ah, that's good. And then you circle back and land. Now, my brother has an axiom in flight tests, and it has a lot to do with decision making. And he says, there is a direct correlation between sex and flight test. Insofar as they both must be done in private, with only the required participants, and to violate that protocol will degrade the performance. Want me to say that again? Sex and flight tests should be done in private with only the required participants, and to violate that will degrade the performance. Now, what he's talking about is the ease of decision making. Now, every time you go out and there's something wrong with it, the winds are out of limits or something, there's no other pressure whatsoever. And you make the right decision. Something wrong, not just quite right, so you take it back and you fix it. And you go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And there's no outside pressure. Only the required participants. Until one day they come up and he said, "Dick, we're doing pretty good, and we want to have we have some investors, and we need to prove to them that we can actually fly a rocket-powered airplane. And 2 weeks from today, on a Thursday at 10 o'clock in the morning, we're going to invite all these people out. They're going to come around from all over places, and then you are going to demonstrate a rocket-powered airplane." Sex and flight test, right? And I thought, Dick, this is probably the most dangerous flight you'll ever fly, because there's an outside influence for you to fly this thing. And I really worried about that. 2 weeks goes by. We did a couple other tests. Things are really looking good. And so now it's coming up for the big day. They have a big tent, press releases, and cameras out there, a lot of press and people there, and investors. And so I get up that morning, and sure enough, the winds at Mojave are okay. So I show up early. Winds are perfect. Now in Mojave, we have a 3-mile-long runway, and we have a couple other runways that allow us to abort into. So at any time during the whole flight, I can shut the engines off and easily dead stick into a runway. It's really a perfect place to do flight tests. And all of a sudden, about an hour before the flight was supposed to go, all the people had shown up, the winds came up, and the wind started getting stronger and stronger out of a direction it almost never flies, never comes from Mojave. It's a southwest wind, and they're mostly northwest. And it got stronger and stronger. And then pretty soon, it was to the point that, hey, you know, this is going to deny us. It was impossible to fly from the primary runway because of the wind gusting. And I go over to Grayson and I says, hey, I'm sorry about this, but the winds are out of limits and, you know, there's no way we can fly this mission. And he says, Dick, you got to fly it. You got to. I says, well, you know, the only way that we possibly wind-wise is a short runway, and it takes us right directly over town. You know, you can't do that. Now, I don't have a dog in this hunt at all. It's no skin off my dust. But those two guys, there's a huge thing on ride for them, and they're not really pilots. And so they tow the airplane over to the approach end of the other airplane, and I says, hey, Dick, you can't do this. I know better. Bert would not allow us to have an outside influence do something to violate a flight test rule. So I went out there and he says, please, please, you got to fly this thing, Dick. My whole company, everything I own, my employees, the thing's done. You got to fly it. And he literally got on his knees, begging me. And so I flew it. And I violated the protocol big time, but I felt sorry for him. And so now my tail is in big risk for nothing. I wasn't even getting paid for it. And so at the end of the runway, looking right over town, we're going to fly a rocket-powered airplane, and no chance for an abort if anything goes wrong. So we flew it. Mike Melville rolled in on my wing for the dead stick landing. Big, strong crosswind, and we successfully flew the airplane. But we got away with it, and we violated our protocol. And so we shouldn't have done that. And so outside influences, and to think, well, you know, we've all heard of get home-itis and all those other things. But I'll guarantee you that just like Dick did on that day, there will be times when you will be intimidated by an outside influence. And the only way everybody's there and they're going to be there. The only way that you can make sure that you're not is to never put yourself in that position to start with. Like I shouldn't even have accepted the flight. I tell you what, why don't we run that movie? And it's about the North Pole. Anybody been to the North Pole? Anyway, we had an AN-2 Antonov, and the Antonov was a Russian airplane. And I says, wow, here I'm sitting in the cockpit of an Antonov, and this AN-2, it's a bi-wing, big radial engine, single engine, kind of the workhorse of the Russian. And for 20 years, that airplane was on my shoot-down list. If I see one, hey, that's an enemy, and I can shoot him down. And I said, how ironic to that. So we're at Barrow. Can you see that? Everybody? Why can't I see it? Okay, nobody likes me. Okay, I'll watch it over here. There we go. So anyway, we're on our way to the North Pole. And if I shoot some video, the inside of the cockpit and so forth, and also there's some outside video. And remember, it's going to take us 10 hours to get from Barrow, Alaska to the North Pole. And then we're going to keep on going once we landed, and we're going to go on to Spitsbergen, where all the early Arctic explorers took off from. And then we're going to come back. And it was on our way back that this particular thing happened. And have you ever seen a Russian cockpit? Everything's in Kopek, attitude indicators upside down. It's kind of a weird thing. But anyway, classic Russian airplane. Another thing is that the compass doesn't work up there. And so they had an astro compass that the guy used, and he could shoot the sun and so forth. However, we cheated. We had a GPS. And with a GPS, you can find your way to the North Pole, and you know you're there exactly. But this is what the Arctic ice cap looks like. And it's fractionated and moves, and it's very fluid. In fact, if you're at the North Pole, the ice moves between 4 and 12 miles a day. And if you're looking down on the North Pole, it goes counterclockwise. So there's big pressure ridges. Some of them are beautiful, some of them are big. It looks just like the Sierra Nevada to me. But you talk about desolation. So at a very low airspeed, and two of us, we're going to the North Pole. And as long as we stay on that right longitude line, eventually we'll get there. Now, what's going to happen is that, and here again, it's violating your own protocol. There's two airplanes and a Cessna 185, and he has the back seat, about 300 or 400 gallons of fuel, and we both have fuel for about 18 hours. And so he's going to land first because he has skis, and they're circling around at the pole, and they, of course, all these guys are all Arctic pilots, and they're all Arctic pilots, and I'm just a desert rat, and they all just laughed at me because I try to say that it's ice speed, and no, I say it's ground speed, and they said, no, it's dummy, it's ice speed. Now, we're on final approach for the last time this airplane will ever fly, and we're going to land in this place, and you see the little dot? If you look real close, you can see that the tracks that he made are really dark, and that means that the ice is really thin. But none of the guys picked that up for some reason. And we roll up. Now, the protocol is that the guy's going to get out, Lee Heron, and he's going to drill a hole in the ice to make sure it's thick enough. And then he's going to call us, and then we're going to land. However, we've already landed. And I'm just a good co-pilot, so I never ask why. And I'm sure as hell not going to say anything. Anyway, everything's cool. We're letting the engine run down. We've been here before. Looks exactly the same as it did last time. In fact, it looks exactly the same for the last 12 hours because it's all the same. And the guy up there, he's a lawyer, and he's making the yellow snow, and that's kind of a ubiquitous thing he has to do. And I says the ice cap got mad at us for him doing that to it. I think they're going to get even with us here in a minute. So anyway, there's Lee. He's getting out of the airplane, and he's hooking up his ice auger, and he's going to drill a hole in the ice. And so we're sitting there. This is cool. I'm an old head, done this before. Looks pretty much the same. I'm checking the GPS, and we're within about, I don't know, a couple, 15 or 20 meters from the actual North Pole, based on what that says. And then he drilled a hole in the ice. Oh, my God. He says it's really thin, and he's looking at our wheels, and it's all bent down, and they were saying, go, 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 get out of here. And they're getting very highly active, go, go. And that was a huge mistake because we landed, and there's pressure ridges out there, and they could be 3 miles away or it could be 30 feet away, and there's no fine way to tell the difference. And so the only thing he had to do is he had to make a turnaround to take off the same way that we landed. And that was a big mistake. Now, don't blink. Watch really close, because as about halfway around the turn, our mission ended. Don't blink. And there we go. Now, they tell me it's cold, and they tell me it's really deep, and I believe them. So the only thing we have to do is the steam comes off the engine, and the thing's going deep 6. We got to get out of the airplane. And so there's 5 of us in there, and they're all piling out. And I left the video running, and if you look real close, you can see a rear end of somebody and somebody's shoes. Anyway, we get out. Now, in emergencies sometimes, you handle the emergency, and it doesn't dawn on you until sometimes later. So I'm walking around the airplane and filming it, and it's slowly sinking down. And it finally hits me. And I say something to the effect, it says, well, we're at the frickin' North Pole. The airplane is crap, and I don't know what's going to happen to us. But I do know one thing, it's going to be a much better chapter in my book. Now, as it continues to sink, eventually we go back, and Ron, the aircraft commander, we elect him to go inside and get all the rescue stuff out as it continues to go down. And they couldn't decide who's going to go back in the Cessna and who's going to stay. And so now nobody knows we're up there, and the Cessna has to take off and use his HF radio to call for rescue. Now, we're trying to make up a story why we were there and why we needed to be rescued. And we're talking about investigating the sex life of ice worms, but nobody would buy that. The only good news is that Ron is a big hero, an Arctic hero. And he went out and found somebody, there was somebody lost. You know, there's always somebody in Alaska that flies out and they get lost. And they searched for him for 42 days and they gave up the search. And Ron went out and continued to search for him, and he found the guy 64 days later. And he was a big hero. And so when Ron Sherdown, when he asked to come up and be rescued, there was nobody going to give us any problem about that. And I was sure glad it was him. One thing they dispatched a C-130 to come up and rescue us. And so it actually was halfway up there. And so somebody says, well, what are you going to do? He says, well, we're going to jump. We're going to have 2 parajumpers, and they're going to jump out. And somebody says, well, what are you going to do now? I mean, then you have 7 guys instead of 5. And he says, is the weather okay? Yeah, the weather's okay. And is nobody hurt? Nobody's hurt. And so they turned around and went back and landed. And they hired First Air. And First Air was they run commercial work in the high Canadian Arctic. And in fact, they even run tours. You can pay somebody and you go up there and they'll fly you to the North Pole. I don't know why. I mean, once you're 200 miles out, it all looks the same. You know, it's not like you're going to meet Santa Claus or something. It was just the bragging rights because my GPS says, hey, I'm off the North Pole. Anyway, they came up and we weren't there too long, but it was really strange too. We had a tripod set up to take everybody has to take the photograph of the North Pole. and so I was sitting there, and a lot of the guys went to sleep, but I was so full of adrenaline, I says, wow, this is the height of adventure. I'm going to go out and roam around and see what's out here and see how far that pressure ridge is. And so we're trying to eat the fresh fruit before it froze, and I was eating an orange, and I'd peel off a little bit of an orange, and I'd put it at the end of that shadow. And a few hours later, I'd come back and mark it again, and then mark it again. And I realized you Boy Scouts, you know the story, that you can tell true north and local mean time by the shadow. It's pretty cool. And it was the only place on planet Earth where that shadow would make a perfect circle. And the sun was up about 35 degrees, and it just went sideways. It never went up, never went down. And if you hate night flying, boy, that's the way to be, because there's no night up there at all. And so we built a yurt, a little place for survival, and the airplane's going down lower and lower. And so I'm sitting there talking to one of the guys, and he walked up to me, and he fell through the ice. There was a crevasse. But it was a fractured, it wasn't a big crevasse like in a glacier where you fall hundreds of feet. He just fell down up into his, up to his shoulders or up to his waist. And so he pulled him out. And fortunately, they built the yurt, the little shelter we built, right between 2 of these fractures. And I says, wow, that's really neat. How did you guys know that? Well, they had no idea. They did it just by accident. So I had a lot of fun teasing them. Anyway, I decided that I wasn't going to go roaming around by myself anymore. He mentioned, real quick, he mentioned the guy's throwing up. And I got a throw up story. Now, I was a navigator and before I went to pilot training, and I was assigned to Travis Air Force Base in the Cuban Missile Crisis. And we were flying C-124s. And the C-124s, our mission was to drop the 82nd Airborne out over Cuba, and we were all training for that whole thing. Some of you older people remember those times. Yeah, those were some times. So we were up at Fort Benning, Georgia, and we're just dropping a whole bunch of guys, you know, get all trained up and so forth. And we do a simulated low-level training mission, not just take off going to the drop zone. We'd go and fly about the same amount of time it would take us to get to the target. You know, a kind of a low-level training exercise. And the kids would get sick. A lot of them would get sick. Now this, this loadmaster, he was really a kick, Air Force loadmaster with all these Army guys. And what he would do, he had his little plastic spoon in there. And what he would do, he would take some an alphabet soup, you know, chopped up alphabet soup, and he'd open it where nobody could see, and then he'd put it in the sick bag. And so then he'd stagger around, you know, like he was, you know, like he was really getting nauseous and turning green and stuff, just messing with those poor kids. And then all of a sudden he just got the bag out and he was playing like he was throwing up in it. And so then when everybody was watching him, it said, hey, this is the Air Force jump master. Boy, look at, he is really wretched sick. And so he takes his bag and he rolls it down and he gets his spoon out. And he starts eating it. Well, for all the kids, half of them were sick anyway. That emptied everybody out. And there was one of the Army sergeant. He didn't think that was too funny. And actually, our loadmaster, he carried it a little too far, and he got court-martialed. But anyway, they're all in their stick, you know, and they're getting ready to go, and the green light comes on, and they're going down, and they're jumping out. Well, the last guy out, he had thrown up, and he held it. And just before he went out the door, he threw it in the face of this jump master. And the jump master jumped out right after him. Well, it was really funny because all the Army parachutes, and all of a sudden there's this white and orange one hanging there and coming down. And, of course, he got a lot of trouble because he left his post. And I guess rightfully so, but I thought it was a real good story anyway. Now we talked a little bit about, well, let's see, time is up. I'll tell you a little story about about fatigue. It's the end of the Voyager flight, and I stayed awake for 3 nights in the seat because the co-pilot couldn't fly the airplane. And so I was going into the 4th night and finally had to get some sleep. So I laid down. But the long and the short of it was for that week-and-a-half flight, I got very, very little sleep, a lot of fatigue. And it's the last 8 hours. We're going to be 8 hours. We're going to be home. And we had some fuel problem, and the long and the short of it was that we messed around and we failed both engines. We were totally dead stick, and I couldn't get it started again. Had a big problem. And so we're in a descent, and I got all the fuel valves. Everything was set, and the damn thing has got to start. You know, it's got a fuel cell that's got fuel in it. I can see the fuel. Why doesn't it start? And so we're in a glide for about 2.5 minutes, totally dead stick. And just before that, I was thinking, wow, Gina, we got this thing made. I had all these nightmares about running out of fuel 100 miles short and never having another opportunity to ever do this again. Comes so close, but yet didn't get it. And so when we finally did our last fuel checks, we found we had a whole bunch of fuel. We could have went on to New York City. Well, as I was going around and selecting the last couple of fuel cells that we knew they were full, and I selected them and turned the pumps on, and we found one pump had sheared a shaft and it ran away, and the pump failed, sheared a shaft, and then all that fuel in that last cell to get home was trapped. And the other one ran a little while longer, and it pumped about 3 gallons, and it was empty. And now we weren't going to New York City or our destination. We didn't even have enough fuel right then to recover the airplane on a suitable field. And for 5.5 years, and being so close to home, I kept thinking, you know, we were good people. We did this thing for all the right reasons. We worked hard. We deserve this. How could fate be this cruel? So after about 2 minutes of feeling sorry for myself, Mike Melville called me and he says, "Hey, Dick, you got any firing? You got any pressure? You know, fuel pressure, any firing?" And I says, "Mike, I got negative pressure, I got negative firing, I got negative anything." And he said one word, said, "Roger." Thought he'd never see us again. But since one fuel cell out at the tip was empty, the other one was still full of fuel, but trapped, the airplane turned out to be in a spiral. Now, the perception was, hey, Mojave, or Edwards Air Force Base, is straight ahead. I did not physically make a turn. Therefore, the perception is that I'm going straight. Although you're down in the cockpit trying to figure all this stuff out, the airplane started into a spiral. Not a spin, but a spiral. And I remember sitting there looking at that thing, and the perception was so strong, like guys that get into graveyard spirals and stuff. I looked up, and the moon is going by. And the perception was so bloody strong that I says, somebody is moving the moon. Now, this comes about a lot of fatigue with very little sleep, and you become really kind of numb and, I don't know, shell-shocked in some way. Somebody's moving the moon. And I thought, that son of a gun, he's moving the moon. Now, here I am with this horrible emergency, and somebody's out messing with me. Messing with me. And I said, I'm going to find that guy, and I'm going to kick his butt. I mean, how could he do this to me? And it never even dawned on me that we were the ones that were going around, because the perception was that we were going straight and I didn't turn, therefore we're still going straight. Somebody's moving the moon. And I sat there for a handful of seconds thinking, what shall I do? Shall I go and find that guy and kick his tail because I'm really mad at him? Or maybe out of work and figure out how to get this damn engine fixed again? And I went to Condor, and I made the big decision that time. And I says, I think maybe I ought to get the engine running. But I'm going to kick his tail later when I find him. Anyway, we did get the things sorted out and get him running and whatever. And climbed back to altitude and changed some pumps around and actually landed 8 hours later at Edwards Air Force Base, having accomplished aviation's last milestone. But I often thought about that very strong perception and how overriding that is. And I'm about 15 over, and since there's nobody behind me, I give you a shot at a couple of questions if you like, and then I'll say, let you all get to bed. Yep, he wants to know how he went to the bathroom. That's what they all ask. No, I'm just kidding. He was talking about the wingtips dragging. And yeah, they did drag, and they did drag on the runway. And the reason was that the nose was down too much, and we had more fuel in it, and they scraped, and we didn't catch it. But real quick, I'll leave you this last one. It's really neat. We flew around the world, got credit for it and everything. And the guy says, hey, there's a barber shop in this little jerkwater place called Quartz Hill. And you go in there, and he's got one barber chair, and he gives really good haircuts, and the guy really loves aviation. I says, okay, well, I'll go and give it a try. I need a haircut. Sure enough, I walk in there, he's got a barber pole. There's one guy sitting in, one guy in a chair. He looks like an older guy, had been there a long time. And I looked in there, and sure enough, there's pictures all over the walls. And so I'm sitting there, and he starts cutting my hair. So clip, 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 clip. I says, hey, it looks like you like aviation, right? Like airplanes. Clip, clip, clip. Yep, like airplanes. Been here a long time. Seen a lot of them come and go. Clip, 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 clip. I says, hey, what's that long, skinny airplane over there? He says, oh, that's the Voyager. Clip, 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 clip. The Voyager, you say? I said, what's so special about that? Clip, clip, clip. And he says, well, it flew around the world. Around the world, you say? Really? Yep. Clip, 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 clip. But then, in a very low tone, in a very authoritarian voice, and he looked around to make sure nobody was listening. He says, however, I have it on good authority, just like your question was, I have it on good authority that they drug the wings on the runway, and they knew that they couldn't make it. And so they went out off the coast of California, and they orbited for 9 days. And they came back, and they said that they went around the world. So I took the cape off, and I'm going to pay my bill. And I noticed that there's a fairly big picture of Gina and I standing there. And so I walked over to there, and I'm looking at the picture, you know, like. And he didn't figure it out. And I never did tell him that he was actually cutting the hair of the prevaricating pilot that lied about flying around the world. Anyway, if you go and get a haircut, he'll probably tell you the same story, even 30 years later. God bless you all. Have a great time. Thank you for your interest. Thank you.
All right, thank you.
And I did remember it. Oh, you want that back?
Yep. Got to use it tomorrow night. Very cute, kid. Thank you. Oh yeah, I'll work on that first.
Hi.
Is this where he'll come out?
Probably.
Okay.
Yeah. You have at least one fan who's down at the bottom of the stairs.
What's that?
You have at least one fan who's down at the bottom of the stairs.
You nailed it.
Bravo.
Okay.
That was wonderful.
It was fine.
It was
a nice flow.
It was so nice and genuine and a nice flow of things. It wasn't like I've got this speech and I'm reading it.
No, I just took
It's
a bunch
great.
of anecdotes.
And that's what people love.
That's all it is.
Did something different.
Yeah.
Well, it's good to see you
You're
again.
right, I've told it darn Forger story so many times.
Yeah.
You were
Probably the
usually
only
here
one in the
talking
universe
Voyager,
that hasn't.
and you know, before and after and everything. But
I'm waiting for the thumb drive.
they're going to get it now.
Oh, yeah, okay.
I just got cold. But we'll get it.